personal microphone doesn't seem to be working, so we will need to work with a handheld microphone this afternoon. Welcome to our third Q&A in the Crypt, with our special presenters today, Geraldine Doouge and Peter Joseph, and welcome to you both. At the back of the hall there are lots of handouts, but in particular, can I mention this one? For those of you who have been here over the past two sessions, you will know that Michael has been producing a document that's given us some history of Vatican II. And this is an additional one of those today. I'll say something more about it at the end, but please don't forget to take one of those. Michael's not with us today. He's down with a very bad dose of the flu. He rang me late last night to ask me if I would step in. So my name is Kevin Grant. I'm the president of Catalyst for Renewal, and I'll be your MC for this afternoon. And so without further ado, I'll kick the proceedings off and introduce to you our first presenter, Geraldine Doouge. She lost the toss. Geraldine was the host of Radio National's Life Matters program for 11 years. She received a United Nations Media Peace Prize and 2 Penguin Awards for her role in the ABC TV coverage of the Gulf War. She has been the host of Compass on the ABC TV since 1998 and is host of Saturday Extra on Radio National. She received the award of the Officer of the Order of Australia in 2003. Geraldine was married to ABC executive Ian Carroll, who died from pancreatic cancer on the 19th of August last year. She has 2 children and 2 stepchildren. Will you please welcome Geraldine?
Battling with the microphone, poor microphones follow me around. I battled with them at the ABC and now battle with them here. So we're resorting to this. So invited as I have been to consider the question why I am still a Catholic. I have, Peter and I have had to wrestle this to the ground, and we've had some good chats. It's hard. It's hard thinking it through and putting words to it, and it's proven the need of quite a lot of contemplation to try to give a good account and honest answers to that question, why one is still a Catholic. In truth, sometimes I'm not sure why I bother. I know the church is part of my identity. I've discovered that during crises in my life, and I discovered it just coming up to 12 months last year when my husband died. I know it can be the source of consolation without peer. And really, I know that I can't slough it off. It's just too embedded in me, in the way I see the world and the way I see myself. It's a truly symbiotic relationship, which I actually take for granted, if I'm to be completely honest, when I think about it. It's an odd way to put it. It's a treasure, but I take it for granted, which I think is one of the products of being formed in post-World War II Catholic Catholicism, Australian Catholicism, with its strong Irish inheritance. It was just honestly part of the ether. It's been one of the most rewarding venues of growth and stimulation in my life, and I've said that many times, and I believe that if you do hang in there and grow with it, that great offering of Jesus Christ comes true in ways you can't dream possible. I have come to bring you life and bring it in abundance. Abundant life. It's such a booty, it's such a beautiful, just couple of words that really take you beyond words often, and certainly when you're a child and you hear that, I think you've got no idea what that means, and maybe you haven't even as an adult, but I gradually come to grasp this the older I get, and I'm not about to step aside from that easily. Abundant life, because I do twin it with my religion. But the unfolding headlines of late about our church, together with what I've forced myself to look at square in the face, have definitely tested those verities, I have to concede. I think I've been through a little bit of an epiphany, lovely biblical word, again, that I had no idea what it meant, all those humble catechism classes, but now I come to realise it. And I think that epiphany is this, that deep down, I have come to believe that maybe the world beyond the institutional church is a kinder, gentler place, full of more conscientious ethics and values and care for others than the official church, which is a pretty extraordinary decision to have reached, actually. That the much criticised secular world in which lay people live, I mean we all live, but lay people, that is their realm, is probably more functional and more ready to conscience examine than the institutional church. It's an extraordinary thing to think about. So it naturally prompted a further round of reflections. Why am I then still a Catholic? Well, I think that Vatican II's central idea of a pilgrim church did influence all of that formation that I've just sketched. I think it did influence my thinking as a young 20-something believer very considerably, and possibly again I realise that the older I get. It raised my expectations about faith and the institution. It stretched me, but it was a slow burn. There was nothing hasty about it. On the surface there was a lot hasty. You know, I was still at school, the nuns' habits changed, we've all had that conversations. Yes, that was hasty. But I think only very gradually did my Catholic identity really shift. The Mercies who formed me would have certainly recognised me, put it that way. I've remained very much a faithful adherent, that's the point I'm trying to make. But I have sought out broader church experiences, typically through Catalyst for Renewal, by a lot of good reading. I find the tablet an extraordinarily important source for me, ongoing, the London-based journal that I think a lot of us do read. I've been talking to them lately ever since we had Clifford Longley out, their guest, to try to see if they could possibly reduce the price. They said, why can't we get a bigger readership in Australia, or people share them? They want to get people to sign up for individual subscriptions. And I said, well, the cost is just staggering. Couldn't you get people on a sort of a staged subscription? Anyway, they're thinking about it. And I have an Ignatian reading group that gives me once a month. I gather with a group of women and we go through a chapter by chapter of a range of books by Father James Martin, SJ, some of you may have heard of. So I've sought things out, but without the sense that the ordained officials of the church had so powerfully lost their way, would I be speaking to you like this, talking about my really quite rigorous audit of why I'm still a Catholic? Well, I don't know that I would. I didn't want to come to these conclusions. That's what I'm trying to say. That when I sort of came to realise that the institutional church had decided it had to protect its priestly caste above all, rather than the most vulnerable. And if we went to Bishop Geoffrey Robinson's seminar, 2 weeks ago, it was very, very interesting to hear how he thought that theology had grown up. I found that very helpful, actually. But that was a shocking, gradual, slow realisation for me. I don't think it can get any worse now. I think that I've got to the bottom of the realisation, much more maybe than a lot of, and I suspect I'm not alone. I think a lot of people, lay people and people in the institutional church have come to that recognition. But, there's a lot of shame, actually, there. I think for all of us to share, and so you cross a particular Rubicon in your attitudes as a Catholic that I didn't want to cross, because I'm really quite a compliant person, and it took me a while to think, well, I'm sort of foolish at best and cowardly at worst if I don't have the guts to look this crisis in the eye and see devastating dysfunction at a systemic, not just an individual level, in an institution that's so close to my own value centre. So in its own way, it required a self-audit. And so I have to say, what next? Why am I bothering? Or do I just retreat into something very small, into those little sort of reading groups and just say, well, I'll be comfortable? Mind you, that's certainly not what I think the tradition asked of me. So I suppose I did have to think, well, if I believe in the wonders of our great tradition, how could I, knowing what I know, or sort of passing the verdict that I have, what should I do in terms of applying it to my own life? Because there's a great line that Father Andrew Hamilton in a recent Eureka Street, I think it must have been last year now actually, wrote in terms of trying to hand it on to the next generation, because I've got 4 children, 2 stepchildren, 2 of my own. How do you hand it on? And he said he'd been told they don't want our Catholicity, which was mildly devastating. So in other words, you think, well, then what am I going to do if I do believe I'm going to be in it? I've got to work out whether I want to hand it on. And I really did want to leave the bulk of all of that handing on to them, the officials. I wanted to be there as a faithful adherent, and I wanted to turn up, and I wanted the job of ritual and of teaching and of administration and, if I can say, sort of spreading the word. I wanted all of them to do it. And I feel now, in a way, a bit naive about that. I suppose I do wonder about how we lay people have let this happen. Because, you know, we are the ones who've lived through, most of us, a lot of us I think, some extraordinary reform in a range of institutions that we've worked in, lived in. You know, in the media, I can think of about 3 major restructures that I've been through, both at Channel 10 and the ABC. I know Peter has, in his world of finance, huge cataclysmic or sort of disruptions that have forced institutions that thought that they were very much belonged in a particular niche to look at themselves again. Why did we imagine that the church would escape that? So, you know, we sat back and we let, to that extent, we let it happen. Now you might say, well, no, we didn't. A lot of us tried hard. I know a lot of us tried hard, much harder than I did. But I suppose I think that it is worth reflecting on how we imagined that this thing, if it's so precious and it's so central to values, transmission and core message and sort of whole guardian of the spirit of our community and what we think matters. Do we imagine that we're going to go through this extraordinary ICT revolution, the amazing turbulence of post-World War II, which of course John 23rd recognised and set in motion something? Did we imagine that it would escape? Now we certainly, you never see the nature of the crisis. That's why you can say it in theory, but the actual innards of it, one doesn't see. And we never saw, of course, sexual abuse. My God, who would have ever dreamt that up as a sort of ghastly blight on our precious church? But that's the way, for a range of reasons, it demonstrated itself. And now I think we have to look that in the eye and know that, and in a way, the sorrow is facing it, but once faced, it then frees you, I think, to actually move on and start to think constructively. So again, it raises the issue, why do I bother? And I've really tried. I thought again last night, sat there with my pen. I think I'd feel so much poorer without a consciously cultivated faith. It anchors me. And somehow, in ways that elude my capacity for language, I have to confess to you, my tradition accompanies my character. That's the best way I can describe it. It introduces me to the notion of a journey in life. And you know, this is really precious. A lot of people don't have that journey. They just go in little blobs of episodes, none of which appear to have any meaning. And they blunder forward. I interview lots of them. They blunder forward, wondering what the hell is over that next horizon, because it doesn't make any real sense and they can't see a map of any sort. Well, actually, when you think about it, we were introduced to the notion of a journey in faith, a growth. It's a wonderful metaphor and consolation. I think it brings with it a greater capacity for rapture, for beauty, for sensuality, for joy. It also brings, oddly enough, a capacity for vices on a big scale, because emotions, I would argue, are not mortgaged in the scheme of things we've inherited. Big emotions are not regarded as terrifying. They're actually admitted and approved of. Then the sort of secondary, this is what I think is so sort of magical about it. We're sort of invited to live big, and then we're invited to abide by a code that harnesses those emotions for the sake of ourselves and others. So it's this sort of marvellous interlocking faith of possibilities. I read that once when I was a teenager. The Redemptorists used to sort of distribute those little brochures on the chairs. They did in WA anyway. It's sort of like a little reading material. And this Father Stinson, William Stinson, I think he was, wrote this: "Ours is a faith of possibilities." I just found that as a teenager incredibly inviting, and I think it is not a faith of limitations. I mean, it has its limits, most wisely, but it is a faith of possibilities. That is, to me, the genius of Christianity. So I think it helps me also, the reason why I bother, it helps me fulfil the natural human urge to make meaning. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, Chief Rabbi of the UK, writes beautifully about humans being meaning-seeking animals. And that's why it sort of leads to my next thought. I have a profound belief that a total vacuum of belief leads to terrible drift, which we see, and often far worse, because people will reach for something because this drift is so awful. I do believe that our children and grandchildren will be immensely the poorer if they don't grow up exposed to a Catholic sensibility without access to this rich tradition of belief and consolation, a glimpse of the divine, a glimpse of it, the whole notion of commitment, the artistry just contained within our tradition. So, we have to work out, I would suggest to you, those of us who are here, who come out on a Sunday afternoon, we have to decide how much we really value it in our lives. How much have we replaced it with other elements? It's a very contested space, meaning, these days, in a place like Australia. There's lots of goodness around, lots of people searching. We might have not realised how much the church has to sit there jostling with a lot of others. Have we willingly left it to the officials, as I say? Have we sort of abandoned them and left them unreformed when all about is institutional reform? And not at the pace we choose, by the way. A lot of us know that, sitting in the secular world. So, I don't think I can stand back from all of this the big one, this notion of Catholic identity. Would I do well if I sort of step forward really, like even if it was on offer? I don't even want to do that, but let's say someone said to quite a few of us, well, step forward and take these leadership roles. I don't think I'd be good at it. I'm not proposing that. There are a whole lot of roles required that I didn't even imagine would be necessary, but they are. They are. We have to think about that. Am I up to St Edmund Campion's great statement? I got this from one of the Riverview masses I went to, and it's just had a powerful impact on me. Before returning to England in Elizabethan times and to almost certain martyrdom from France. This was his wonderful, incomparable, majestic invitation. The expense is reckoned. The enterprise is begun. It is of God. It cannot be withstood. So the faith was planted. So it must be restored. Very stirring stuff, requiring courage and degrees of surrender. Am I up for it? Are you up for it? I'll leave the question open. Thanks.
Our second presenter this afternoon is Peter Joseph. Peter is the chairman of the Black Dog Institute at the St James Ethics Centre and the Health Science Alliance, New South Wales University campus. He is director of the Advisory Council, Emergency Architects Australia, and former chairman of Dominion Mining Limited, the GPT Group, and St Vincent's Mater Hospitals, Sydney. Peter had a 30-year association with the banking group BT Australia until it was sold. I hope not out from under him. And more lately with Investec Bank. And he was awarded membership of the General Division of the Order of Australia in 2001. Peter has been married to Nettie, who is here today, for 43 years, and they have a wonderful family all living in Sydney. Please welcome Peter.
And part of the family's at the door here. Everyone would like to meet little Coco. She'd love to meet you. I just say thanks to my good friend and colleague Geraldine, beautifully spoken, from the heart, and I just love that notion of a faith of possibilities. Notwithstanding me, like Geraldine, I feel that we live, unfortunately, in a dysfunctional world, and certainly in a dysfunctional church. Apropos of today's conversation, I told our youngest daughter, Millie, that while in many respects I'm a product of Catholic institutions, my mother, who she never knew, was Anglican. And Millie straight away said, "Anglicans rock, girls can be priests." I thought that said quite a bit about the Catholic Church. So what does it mean to be a Catholic? No one has ever asked me that question. And when Geraldine rang, this could be hard. And as she said, we kind of wrestled it to the ground, and I'll come at it from a somewhat different perspective, but without comparing notes, there are a lot of similarities. I've never, not having thought about it seriously, it was simply that Christianity was my tradition, and being Catholic, that was my tribe. That was it. It wasn't too complicated. There's been a lot of love, kindness and compassion in my life, in good times and in bad, and that's defined both my life as a Catholic and as a human being. And perhaps I could better say that it was the people like yourselves, who, from many backgrounds, who extended that love, kindness and compassion that has defined my life. To get to that almost embarrassingly simple conclusion, your question has taken me on an extraordinary journey. And to do it justice and to find some sort of coherence, I too was wrestling with questions, problems, inconsistencies, contradictions, and she told me I wasn't allowed to get angry. Not dissimilar perhaps to many of us here today. I found that a lot of the problems do relate, obviously, to the institution and hierarchy of the church, sadly, as opposed to the essence of the church, looked at through the life of an Aramaic-speaking carpenter who lived 2,000 years ago, who spoke in parables, not laying down laws. In fact, he said that all of the law, not some of the law, but all of the law, in fact, is contained in just two commandments. Firstly, to love your God, which to me is the mystery of life and the sacred of the everyday, and secondly, to love your neighbour. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The common denominator in both commandments is a four-letter word, love. And I believe that it importantly, very importantly, includes love of self. For me, it has been an exploration of the heart, a test of the mind, and a searching of the soul. Staying true to yourself while also challenging was very challenging. And I thank Catalyst for Renewal for that opportunity. It was unexpected. So I'll share with you just 3 stories, and then attempt to join the dots as I go. The first is about growing up, the second is about questioning and conscience, and the third is about joy, sorrow, and love. And it does become deeply personal. So growing up, my family came from Brisbane, though my dad, like his father, actually came from the Northern Rivers. They were born in Moolumbar on the Tweed. He went to Joey's, travelling once a year, down and back by boat. There was no other way to go in those days. He survived that and very sensibly headed north to Queensland. And even more sensibly in later life, he became an avid supporter of the Maroons and the Reds. I have a son-in-law out here who played for the Reds. He survived that, and not so sensibly, he tried growing bananas during the Depression. The end came when he received 5 shillings for an entire crop. He was able to pay his debts, then locked the gate and walked off the property. And then came the war. He was a church-going Catholic and always took his missal to Sunday Mass. I still have it. He didn't question, and we didn't question. He was a man of faith, hope and charity, though he would have some strong opinions on the fire and brimstone, mostly Irish priests that came around. He met my mother, a lovely Queensland girl, Margaret McGee, in Brisbane, but they were only married for 10 years. She died in Brisbane from pneumonia when I was 5, and just 3 weeks after the birth of my younger sister, Susie. My dad was left with four babies, 6, 5, 3, and a newborn. I did not know that my mother had died and was not taken to her funeral. We were told that she had gone on a holiday. That was the way things often happened in those post-war years. I never got to know her, but she was always described to me as a kind, generous, loving and beautiful person in every way. A young sister of charity nun, Sister Tarsicius, or Tarsi to her friends, from St Finbarr School, Ashgrove, where my older sister and I were at kindy, came to help my father for quite some time. She showed extraordinary compassion. My father often spoke of her in later life. Baby Susie was adopted out, a fact I only became aware of years later. The couple, Jack and Jean Lynham, who adopted Susie, had no kids of their own. They were devoted and loving parents. Tragically, when Susie was 5, Jack Lynham, a young barrister and a keen sportsman, he actually dropped dead in the street. Jean, not long after, went to the US with Susie to live with a sister, a war bride married to a career US Air Force, and they lived in Texas. I had a wonderful pleasure just a couple of years ago to go to Washington for the first ever celebration of war brides. It was quite something. At this stage, I'd gone to boarding primary school with my brother Brian at the Mars Brothers at Mount Tamborine, up amongst the rainforest, had its own farm. The kids helped run the farm, which fed us all. There's this wonderful man, Brother Harold, who was a bit of a legend, who just knew a hell of a lot about education. We were let loose on a Sunday morning after Mass in the rainforest. We got to know it like the back of our hands. We could get up to the back of the farmers' orchards and we'd get stuck into the fruit. Then the next week we'd come around the front gate and we'd get paid pocket money to pick the fruit. We had veggie gardens, we had Shanghais, we had air rifles, and you name it. And this man, this brother Harold, his greatest love, I found out later, was actually driving trucks. And later, when he retired, he drove a semi-trailer all around Australia. He was an absolute legend. He was at home, his great love, his vitality for life, his journey was really about the bush. And we left that little school, I've got to be honest, it no longer exists, believing we could do anything. And at age 12, I was off to another Catholic boarding school, Downlands College in Toowoomba, run by some wonderful men, MSc priests and brothers. As things turned out, I absolutely thrived there. And totally by chance, there was a Father Tim Kelly, the headmaster. He was a Cambridge scholar, graduate. He'd done his master's degree there. He was a young priest. He had it open to him to do a PhD. Instead, if you can believe this, in the 1950s, he came to Toowoomba to teach scrubby characters like me about English literature and Australian poetry and you name it. I mean, what caused him to do that, I only found out many years later, and I'll come back to him. But the whole idea of at Downlands was giving you this broad, rich education as far as the church was concerned. As Geraldine said, it was old-time religion, catechism, daily mass in Latin, priests with their back to you, the rosary, the Angelus, benediction, confession, St. Patrick's Day parades, etc. We were deuced in it. But there was this other world, this other wonderful world of sport and cricket and rugby and cadets. We were lethal little buggers with it. We had our own 303s and we taught how to use Bren guns and machine guns and mortars and grenades. And in fact, our final year cadet camp included mock strafings by Canberra bombers at treetop height and jungle treks, very character forming. At age 15, my family life took another turn. Jean and little sister Susie had returned to Australia from Texas and made contact with my dad. One thing led to another. Excuse me. Jean and Sam started going out and they married and the entire family came back together again. That's a good story. It was really interesting. Decades later, I become chairman of St Vincent's Hospital. My stepmom, Jeannie, the only mother I ever knew, she at that time was in a retirement place on the Gold Coast. I got in touch with her. I took her to this assisted charity health conference. I get a tap on the shoulder and someone said, someone wants to meet you. And I said, yeah, well, that's fine. And it would you believe, was Sister Tarsi. So that that was quite a reunion. And the lovely thing is, Tarsi's still going strong. And I've taken her on helicopter rides. I've taken her with all her friends up in Toowoomba all over the place. And I rang her yesterday, and we talked quite a bit, and she told me to make sure you're a very good boy. So it's a remarkable story of love and loss and love again at a time of war and a time of peace. It's about acceptance, persistence, and lovingly journeying on, no matter what happens. It's about hard-working, kind men and women of faith, hope and charity. They love their God, were alive to the world and everything in it as they grapple with the joyful, sorrowful and glorious mysteries of life. They included teachers with all the nobility of that profession. Excuse me. They were my parents and teachers, and they inducted me into the Catholic tribe. For that I owe them much, as it taught me how to think, how to embrace and love life and all its creatures, and how to seek learning in a journey that never ends. Growing up felt pretty good. The second story is really about questioning and conscience, and I'll just break it into two separate stories. One is about Father Tim Kelly, the headmaster from Downlands College, the Cambridge scholar, the man of letters, the man who took that college to a total new dimension, who opened our eyes and ears and hearts to a world of learning that we could not have possibly imagined. He left the church. He married a few years later, and then suddenly we never heard of him again. It was like it sort of disappeared, and he'd been ostracised. He didn't appear in any kind of stories and any of the magazines, the old boys stories or whatever, and I thought, this just doesn't seem right. I didn't know him other than as a school kid, but we had our 50-year reunion in 2009. So we went looking for him, and we found him. He was 94 at that stage. He had been teaching at the University of the Third Age. He'd become a professor of English at Melbourne University. And when he retired there, he taught at the University of the Third Age up until, I think it was 90. Shakespeare was his great love. He came up to our reunion. He was not at all well. He shouldn't have been there. He was, he was so unwell. But we found out later he was so determined to come. He told his family that they didn't help him get there, that he was just going to jump in a cab and come. He kind of knew something, because we were able to say things to him at that reunion which were pretty special, because by that stage we'd learned a thing or two about what he was trying to teach us 50 years before. We were able to do that. He went back, and 2 months later he died. So but his story was one which left me, how could a church treat someone that has done what he has done and gifted to so many people, that he could be just sort of written off. Now, he perhaps didn't feel it as acutely as some of us, certainly as myself, but it was at first sort of questioning that I started to have. Anyway, the other totally different story relates to my buddies, the Sisters of Charity and St Vincent's, went after the drug summit here in Sydney a few years ago, when there was, one of the outcomes was when there's all this drama of people dying up at the cross, something like 100, mostly young people, dying every year. And so the sisters, in their normal courageous way, when asked by the Premier, Bob Carr, would you like to do the trial? They said, yeah, sure, we'd be happy to take that on. They went to Bill Uren, the Jesuit, and for the moral theology, we went along. We spoke to then Cardinal Clancy, who said, "Yep, we should go down this road." They put their hand up. It's announced, and guess what? We get rolled. And how do we get rolled? Well, firstly, there was a gentleman who's just about to go as our wonderful new ambassador to the Vatican, rings me up and says, "This is a bad thing." I said, "What do you mean this is a bad thing?" And the next thing, one thing led to another, and a particular Archbishop of Melbourne puts his hand up. A particular cardinal by the name of Ratzinger gets involved. The sisters get a letter, and guess what? They are told that this will cause scandal. And I'm thinking, what would that Aramaic-speaking carpenter think about all of this? For the 100 people dying every year, you can't very well kind of rehabilitate dead bodies. And I wrote an article in the Bulletin about it, and I did get angry. But again, it was the conscience, the true church to me were those beautiful sisters, and the church that just didn't get it was this kind of Kremlin-like edifice, sitting over there in Rome, saying that somehow the Sisters of Charity are going to give scandal. The good news was that the Uniting Church, a fellow called Harry Herbert, picked it up, and it's gone and still running to this day. And instead of, instead of 100 people a year dying from drug overdoses and so on, it's down to about 10. The final story is about joy, sorrow, and love in all its dimensions. I was doing some postgraduate study in the US and needed money, so picked up a summer job working for the Australian government at Expo 67 in Montreal. It was there I found my earth angel when I met Nettie, who's here today with two of our girls, who had come across from WA, was being there's something about these West Australian women, and was working at Expo prior to going on to London and Europe, as you did. Being a Queenslander and a slow learner, it took me quite a while to get past the card setting stage, but we did meet up in Sydney, and where I'd come back for work reasons, and Nettie for a 3-week visit for a wedding before starting work in Perth. Turned out she never went back, and we've been together for 43 years, as Kevin said. 4 beautiful children later, we're well and truly settled at Northwood here on the lower North Shore, where we bought our first home and never left the suburb. Though Nettie at the time was Anglican, she later chose to become a Catholic. She was happy we send the kids to the little school up the road, St Michael's Lane Cove, on one condition, that we fix up the toilets. Not only did that happen, but we ended up with the support of a wonderful parish priest, Father John Farrer, at Lane Cove. A group of us got together, sold some parish assets and rebuilt the school. We were told by the CEO at the time that they couldn't give us any money because it was the wrong demographic. The school really wasn't going anywhere. Anyway, we rebuilt it, and it went from 200 to 400, now there's a waiting list. We fully engaged in school life at St Michael's, then at Riverview, where St Michael went, and our girls, Kate, Lucy and Millie, went to Loretto, and we made many friends in those school communities. The charism of the Jesuits and the Loretto nuns was inspiring, inclusive and full of spirit and engagement with others in the world. Men for others is the mantra at Riverview, as many of you would know. Impressive women such as Sister Margaret Honour, Sister Anne Kelly, lifelong friends in Greg O'Kelly. Now he's a guy who engages in life. He's now Bishop Greg O'Kelly, Bishop of Port Pirie, or Potpourri as he likes to call it. Other lifelong friends like John Bowie over here, our good friend, who was deputy there and then became a headmaster himself. Chris Gleeson had a long list, not to mention so many great parents and kids who themselves are now our buddies. I was asked to join the board of St Vincent's, and then when I became chair, names like Maria Cunningham, who died just a couple of months ago, absolutely magnificent woman. Claire Knoll and Deidre Hickey, Liz Dodds, Helen Clark, and not to mention the beautiful Josephites as well, where I had a little stint at North Sydney there for a while. And then life hit us in the head with a brick, or more like the entire truckload. Our son Michael, aged 30, took his own life over 6 years ago. He had suffered from depression for much of his school life. It had started around puberty when he was just 13. He came good at the age of 20, and we had some wonderful years with him. Your life stops at your faith, certainly. My faith was fundamentally questioned. And then beyond the shock, I slowly came to realise that humankind has indeed learned a thing or two about living and dying over the centuries. Men and women grieve differently, I learnt that, and that certainly needs to be respected. I think men tend to externalise. I think men women tend to internalise. But slowly you turn your mind to the bigger picture of your life. The idea of the journey comes in. You can sit happily on the side of the road and people will pass you by and say good day or whatever, but the whole idea, the essence of that Christian, that Catholic idea of the journey. The Irish are good at it, where often a funeral will take place a mile out of town, and people will walk with the bereaved from the church back into the town to say, keep going, excuse me, keep going, keep engaging in life. You realise that you're not alone, as everybody comes in love and extraordinary support. I had one man, very well known in this city, whose most of his family, other than his mum, died in the Holocaust. Excuse me, murdered. A couple of them committed suicide, and he ended up with his mother here. And he spoke with a lot of emotion about that with me at the time, and I asked him, well, how did he sort of pick himself up and drive on? And basically he said, I did it for others, and he kept talking about others, and the others in fact were complete strangers. He became very successful. We received another a letter which was amazing, from a young lady in her 30s who lost a sister. And she said that my greatest tragedy has become my greatest gift. I couldn't sort of quite fathom that, but now I do. And it's sort of like, if you allow it, it's like the memory of the person, their life is no longer a burden, but it is something that is with you every day. It does in fact deepen your humanity. I found in a very strange way that what happened in time became faith reaffirming. Faith reaffirming in the sense that I never really thought a lot about the death and resurrection, other than sort of through the Mass and in the context of that. And but I kind of discerned that it applied as much to the living, and that I found very, as I say, reaffirming that whole idea. And the other one, of course, is you know, the doing for others idea, which is something which, in Michael's case, is reflected in what's now his legacy, the Black Dog Institute. When he was well, as a consequence of a professor that we had met at that, when he was in his teens, Gordon Parker. Gordon phoned me and asked if I'd help him set up an institute. I said I would on one condition, and he said, what's that? And I said that you change the name, because it was the Mood Disorders Unit at that time, and I said I wouldn't tell anyone if I was going to do it. But anyway, the Black Dog Institute was a direct consequence of what had happened to Michael. So his life, in fact, has given rise to something that is helping lots and lots of other people. And you can't ask for more than that. We launched something called My Compass just last Monday. It was on the ABC. It went national, which is an e-health tool, which is evidence-based, and we ran a large clinical trial, and we found that it works. It's amazing. You can get it. It's like an app on your iPhone, and you can get access to assistance in all sorts of ways. And we think that for anywhere in the city, but especially in the bush where there's so few services, that it makes a big difference. So in conclusion, it's clear to me, as I've said, that humankind has learned something about living and dying over the centuries, and there's no doubt that the heart of all of the great religions is love. I believe in the idea that religion is deeply etched in human nature and cannot be dismissed as a product of ignorance, indoctrination or stupidity. I also feel we are or can become spiritual beings by loving ourselves and thereby providing the key to fall in love with the divine that is all around us, if you look for it, and love our neighbours as we would have them do to us. Combined, it is a powerful and exuberant life force. At the personal level, I would say this, that in the times of my joys, the times of my sorrows, and the times of my testing, it has been the support of many fellow pilgrims that has helped sustain me. Their love, compassion and kindness was free from the shackles of dogma and theological politics. In their humanity, they did their best to be Christ-like. Women and men, lay and ordained, they are true priests, my priests. They are the church, my church. I'll continue to do all I can to support them, and in that I know I have a ringing endorsement from my earth angel. Thank you.
It's over to the Q&A time. And this is a little bit awkward with the microphone situation, so I will bring the microphone to you if you indicate that you would like to ask a question, make a comment, be a part of a conversation. They're all over the place.
Thank you, Geraldine, because just of recent times I had one of those feelings of, oh, what church am I in here? And what triggered this off, you'll be horrified to know, was a book I was given about Peter Kennedy up in Brisbane. Us Queenslanders always causing trouble. And I'm reading this, and it was based on the different people who had come to his church his church, our church, for all different reasons. And some of them moved on with him to the alternative church. But one of these women said, I could not leave the church that I knew. And I was looking at this different combination of church, and it was like the humankind bit. There was always, all these people were accepted, come as you are, and they were made feel welcome in this church despite their failings and all that sort of thing. But then it's probably Peter Kennedy or somebody lost his way when it came to the institution of the church, so therefore they were divided. And I'm thinking now, who's right in this? Should we go the humankind way? And are we as a church doing that to any great thing? So I thought, oh well, if Geraldine can stop and think about this church, I'm not surprised that I am too. So it just really made me stop and think. And one day I thought, I'm not real sure I should go to Q&A. I think that is really rocking my faith.
Briefly say thank you very much, and to both of you, and for your bereavements. I wish you long life as a Jew, and I'm a Christian also. Thank you very much. And I'm just trying to think what I had to say. I've got a senior moment. I was going to ask about compass. I sort of worship God all weekend because I'm a Jew. I've got two Sabbaths, and I miss compass very much because it's put back to 6 o'clock-ish or something, and so I've been missing it since it wasn't 10 o'clock. And thank you very much too for saying we are all priestly people.
I'd like to thank Peter and Geraldine for those wonderful sharings of their faith, and I, like many others, have struggled deeply with the church in the last few years, and I'd just like to make two comments. One is that as a nurse who spent many years with people with mental illness and all sorts of other traumas, I have never gotten over what happened about the drug centre at St Vincent's. I believe it was a shameful decision. And secondly, there's a most remarkable article in Eureka Street in the last couple of weeks by Father Peter Day from Canberra, and I'd suggest that you all read it if you haven't, and I hope every Australian bishop reads it, because in essence he said that his problem as a young priest, as the church just carries on business as usual after a small apology, he has big problems with the church not coming to grips with this. And I think if you all get that article, you'll be very uplifted by it.
To know that you're not alone, and that two people such as yourself have been going through the same struggle I've been going through. I'm a pre-war person. I was baptised at 5 days old by my lovely mother, and it's because of her. You ask why I'm still a Catholic. My wonderful mother put so much work into making me a Catholic that I just couldn't. I couldn't stop, even if I wanted to. I could not scandalise my mother. My mother has been dead over 40 years, and yet she has this daily influence on me. It's probably the most unreasonable and ridiculous reason for still being a Catholic, but that's my reason. I cannot scandalise my mother.
Dean, I think it was you who mentioned how low can we go in relation to the shame that we all feel in relation to the sexual abuse. The abuse was one level of shame. The next level that I went through was the cover-ups. And now when I read a little bit with Batty Leaks, I'm going even further still. How much lower can we go? The good side is that I've had to decide for myself what is it in the Catholic tradition that I hold on to. Would I change? No, I wouldn't. I've made that choice, and it's the essence of Catholicism, and it is community that keeps me going. But I still ask the question, how low can we go? How much shame are we all feeling? And does the rest of society see us Catholics as absolutely stupid?
It's been a great afternoon, but it's an afternoon we have to call to a halt, I'm afraid. The problem that we have here is that this system of microphones here interferes with the church upstairs, and there are masses that we would interfere with. So we have to draw the day to a conclusion, and I'm very sorry about that. I'll make a final comment of my own, if I may, and that is that we had two wonderful journeys shared with us today, and it seems that our journeys for each one of us is our tradition. In fact, I think that's the true depth of meaning of that word. Tradition means our journey. And if we examine the journey, the tradition of our church, it's a wonderful journey of people being involved in all processes of the church throughout time. We are at a particular point on that journey at the moment where we see a hierarchy that is more stuck in a different interpretation of the word. They are more traditional, which actually suggests that you're stuck in one point in time, rather than being a part of that ongoing journey. But I think that'll come to an end at some stage in the not too distant future, and we'll start to flow forward again. Ever the optimist. Can I, and of course the beginning of that process was the Second Vatican Council, which we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of this year, and consequently the Q&A and the crypt. Father Michael left us with another document which says a little bit about the Second Vatican Council, and in particular some things that I would just highlight out of that. The fundamental choice that had to be made at the outset of the council was whether the council was to govern itself. The council expressed its own mind and asserted emphatically that the dominance of the Curia was not acceptable, nor was the status quo. Reflect. The council spoke directly to the world, especially the poor. This statement not only further distinguished the mind of the council from that of the preparatory commissions, it set the council on a path towards thinking of the church as a sign in the world rather than a sanctuary from it. In particular, Michael asked me to point out to you on the back of this document the reference to the council's unanimous approval of Sacrosanctum Concilium, the document on the liturgy, which he would love everybody to read, and it is readily available on the web. I'll commend that document to you. Thank you so much for your attendance today, and will you also thank, please, our...
That lovely warm welcome. We just arrived in Sydney this morning, so but I think we've been in Adelaide for the last week, so I don't think the sleep apnea is going to overcome me. Hopefully, we've just been dealing with jet lag for the rest of the week, but I think we're reasonably awake now. But you can make up your minds about that by the end of the evening as to how awake we are. Father Michael was gracious, a lovely gracious introduction. Thank you very much indeed. Martin and I both cradle Catholics, like so many of us, born and baptised into the Catholic Church at a time when we couldn't say yay or nay. We were probably each was about a fortnight old when our parents made that choice, which both initiated us into the Christ Fideles, but also, of course, canonically made us members of the Catholic Church, ostensibly for life. And we grew up as Catholics in Belfast. As it happened, most people in Northern Ireland live in ghettoised areas. About 93% of all people who live in Northern Ireland live in areas that are demographically either Catholic or Protestant. Our families, by contrast, for some reason that we've never been able to work out whether it was a true ecumenical spirit or just pure stupidity on the part of our parents, but they bought houses right slap bang in the middle of loyalist Protestant areas, putting us always at immediate risk of being killed at the very worst or bullied at very best. My parents moved 6 times because they started out with no kids and ended up with 9. My family thought they had to increase multiplying for the earth entirely by themselves. And the reference Father Michael made to my 10-month-old grandson, is my 10-month-old grandson, is the 238th direct descendant of my own grandmother. Before she died, she had 60 grandchildren, produced by my mother and her sisters between them. And then in the next generation, my aunt still does the counting, but most of the rest of us, quite frankly, have given up. We're just mortified, perpetually mortified. So that's our background, the hinterland growing up, and Martin and I grew up in Protestant areas in Belfast. All 6 houses that my parents bought in the area that is known as our Doouge, which is mostly characterised as a Catholic ghetto, we managed to miss the Catholic part of it every single time. And it's only now looking back, I think, were they trying to kill us? Did they want us dead? Why did they keep buying houses in these areas? Anyway, that's just by way of background. So, any day of the week, believe you me, it would have been easier to be a Protestant, or an atheist, or anything but a Catholic growing up in a conflicted society where Catholics at that time were still fighting for the vote, still fighting for the right to be treated equally in relation to jobs, and where our church was characterised by an Irish history in which the church was always the underdog, and indeed, importantly for us, the champion of our human rights and our civil rights. So that was our perspective on church, that our church was a champion of human and civil rights. It took a while to realise that that was not always so, either historically or indeed around the world. And particularly as we grew through the 60s and 70s with the continuing emancipation of women, the arrival on the scene in Ireland of the first generation of young people of which we were part, free second level education, free third level education, for which we have to thank largely, in my case, the Mercy nuns, Dominican nuns, and in Martin's case, the Christian brothers, who really took to heart the opportunity that was provided to the Catholic community by free education. So we belong to that generation who were memorably described by Seamus Heaney as having intelligences brightened and unmannerly as crowbars. And they needed to have those crowbars. Mostly they were originally directed at the obstacles that confronted us by way of being Catholics in Northern Ireland, described memorably by a former Prime Minister as a Protestant state for a Protestant people. So there were a lot of obstacles to be removed. We were also the Vatican II generation, and we were proud of our church. It was an intellectual powerhouse at a time when there weren't that many intellectual powerhouses around Northern Ireland. And so it was really only over a period of time in my own case that as I became more and more literate about my church, and in particular as I saw the growing, burgeoning, in our own case in Northern Ireland, the burgeoning issues around women's rights, gay rights, and began to see my church sort of slide behind the curve as a champion of the civil and human rights of others, that it began to occur to me that perhaps I'd been given an edited view of ecclesiastical history, and that I would be better if I became more literate about my church. So I set myself the job of doing that, but in particular how I've come to be here tonight, I suppose, and how I've come to write a book on collegiality in the church, is that after I left office in 2011, I decided that I was going to devote the rest of whatever's left of my days to trying to interrogate my church, because one of the things that I discovered, particularly as a Pro-Vice-Chancellor working in the Queen's University of Belfast, was here was a university which, when I came back to work in it in 1987, had been told that it was unfair to Catholics and unfair to women. Statistically, women were completely underrepresented in all fields, and in particular at professorial level. Statistically, Catholics were invisible, particularly in academic. In fact, the only senior person throughout the university was the head of catering out of 3,000 staff. So that was bad news, and I was part of a team that had to form to try and change that culture. And I have to say, looking today at that university, it has done that successfully. In order to do that, we had to unlearn. We had to strip away self-critique. We had to take the people who were in interview panels, mostly white Protestant males, and introduce them to the reality that you cannot keep on being comfortable around more white Protestant males. You had to open your heart and your minds to all sorts of other possibilities and to all sorts of other genius. And in fairness, that university took that culture change initially not well, but eventually very well. And now we have a situation where we have more or less cracked the issue of Catholics' access to jobs. Not quite so good on the women front, but getting there. So that brings me to my church, where I could say, probably with hand on heart, that I very much doubt if any of our cardinals, and perhaps Bishop Jeffrey, you could speak more about our bishops. I don't know how many of them have been through the kind of training processes in unlearning in relation to equal opportunities and fair employment, sexism, racism, gender bias, all these things, this baggage that we carry with us almost without being aware of it, and that needs to be stripped away if we really are to enter discourse about inclusivity, and in particular about the true meaning of love within the gospel, that loving experience that is supposed to be the love of Christ, all embracing, all forgiving, all good, that it seems to me a church that, memorably described by Pope Francis as over concerned with rules, has managed to drift from. So after I left office, well actually before I left office, I started to study canon law. After I left office, I had done a master's degree in canon law while I was still President of Ireland, and that was my hobby. That and knitting. The knitting kept me sane. The canon law kept me bordering on insane. And then I went to Rome and studied for my licentiate in canon law, and that definitely drove me over the edge. I've been in the Gregorian in Rome ever since, and I've just finished the second year of a doctorate there. The subject of my doctorate is children's rights in canon law. But I wrote a book on collegiality because, having come through the peace process in Northern Ireland, I knew how important structure was, how important laws are, how important it is that if you have an idea, and we had an idea for peace in Northern Ireland, we had an idea and a vision for parity of esteem, for a civic society founded on equality. We had all these grand ideas, and a lot of people shared them. But the only way you could deliver them in such a way that you could sustain the culture change, which would eventually turn its back on centuries of conflict, you were going to need an infrastructural architecture to hold that. And my view very simply was that I wasn't sure that the Catholic Church had that infrastructural architecture available to it. Because we had all the grand ideas that came out of the Vatican Council, in particular collegiality, in particular trying to recalibrate the old feudal primatial monarchical structure, broadening it to give the College of Bishops, as the Vatican Council did. It said for the first time in the history of our church that the College of Bishops has the right, full and supreme power to legislate for the church. But the question then was, well, how does that sit with the primatial power of the Pope? And unfortunately, when the Vatican Council was over, they all packed their cases and went home. And they left no structure in place so that this new concept of collegial power, which was supposed to break down the old feudal system with the feudal courtiers, the system simply was not put in place. By the time canon law caught up in 1983 with Vatican II, the gravitational pull of old ways had already dragged us back. And so we had lost the momentum, the head of steam that had built up in Vatican II, and here we are in 2014, and frankly the church is as much a feudal monarchy as it was in the days of Pio IX, back in the 19th century, virtually unchanged. And except that the Vatican Council had given us this very strong message that the College of Bishops, by direct apostolic succession, by divine right in other words, is entitled to share power along with the Pope. And we got to find some way of doing that. And only the first person really to give us hope that that is possible has been Francis. John Paul threw the word collegiality around a lot, but it didn't really amount to much of a hill of beans. We heard very little of it from Pope Benedict. Both of them, rather regrettably, through the work of Ad Tuendum Fidem, more or less, in my view, wrecked the Catholic Intellectual Academy by imposing on theologians and those teaching in Catholic academies an obligation to teach well within the walls of the teaching magisterium. Now, anybody who's ever worked in an academic environment will know that academics are naturally like members of Al-Qaeda. Their job is to be like kind of mini academic terrorists and to constantly push out the boundaries to take those walls and to push them and see what strength is there, what resistance is there, and most importantly, what lies beyond them. And that's the nature of academic life. That's how we develop knowledge and science. And if we don't do that, we make cowards of our intellectuals, and it seems to me we either make cowards of them or we make outsiders of them. And that's where we have been, it seems to me, for quite some time. My view at the moment is that unless we address collegiality, by which I mean the governance structures of the church, by which I mean the Pope exercising his primatial authority in collegial co-governance with the College of Bishops, however he does that, bearing in mind there's over 5,000 of them. And they may very well have to find some way of having a small subgroup that we might call a synod of bishops. Well, let's call it just a synod. A synod of people. So we might call it that, or he might call it something else, because he's the power to do that. And to make these decision-making bodies, because until they become decision-making bodies, until those who go to Rome, who sit in these bodies, have to bring with them the views of their constituencies, at the moment they don't have to. The dialogue is between curia and bishop, bishop and curia. It is rarely between people and bishop. They don't have to bring that voice with them. And it seems to me that if we did have that collegial structure, if we found the vehicle through which collegiality could, by which I mean decision-making power shared in the church, always acknowledging the primatial power of the Pope and always acknowledging his right of veto, because he would always be the head of the College of Bishops, allowing that. But until that happens, your voice, my voice, is a voice in the wind. Not even carried in the wind sometimes, just drowned out before it even gets, a foot away from our mouths, because nobody is listening except ourselves. Francis has indicated that he wants the synod. He has said publicly that the Synod of Bishops, which I'm sure, as all of you know, was not a creation of Vatican II. It was a creation of Paul VI. Allied, it's an advisory body purely, and its role to advise a primatial pope. It is not a collegial body, never was intended to be, unless you use the word collegial in a kind of a nice namby-pamby kind of way. But in a juridic way, it has no status whatsoever. It could have. Canon law allows the Pope to give it that kind of juridic status. No Pope has ever done so. Benedict was resolute that he never would. But on the other hand, Francis has said that he wants it to be a more effective body. He wants it to be a more collegial body. He doesn't believe the current synod system is an effective system. And most importantly of all, and I'll finish on this and you might think about this, he wants it to work in a way that works towards church unity. Because those of you who are familiar with the writings of John Quinn will know that, and indeed the work of Arkic will know, that synodality and the absence of collegiality are among the major obstacles to church unity. We do not, very simply, John Quinn has said it very, very lucidly, that the kind of synods that we operate do not qualify in the eyes of the Orthodox or the Anglican as sufficiently collegial in order to be able to promote church unity. And incidentally, they are not saying that they want an end to primatial power. The Arkic document going back to 1999 says quite clearly that there is a unifying thing in having papal primatial power. But that power has to be shared with those in apostolic succession, which are the bishops, the College of Bishops, and they in turn have got to open up to the people of God, having dialogue between them and with them, two ways, sideways, up and down, rather than a pyramidical structure where things cascade down from the top and very rarely does the voice from the bottom get heard. It'll be very interesting, all of us who've been watching the synod with the questionnaire that went out around the world, it'll be very interesting to know when we are asked for our views from the bottom up, how seriously are they going to be taken. I live in hope. I think the Pope has created a massive avalanche of expectation, and expectation is infinitely more impatient, infinitely more giddy than hope. And that is now the stick that may be used to break his own back. If it is not delivered on, and frankly, some of the things that we're hearing at the moment from Cardinal Parolin, from Cardinal Baldessari, no doctrinal changes. The Synod is going to talk out to the world and to the legislatures of the world about the family, whereas many of us were hoping that before we would dare to talk to anybody, that we would first put our own house in order. And that the silence which has been communio would be broken, and we would hear our own voices reflected back. Though having said that, how 150 male celibates are going to be the final voice the Pope hears on the family just strikes me as perverse. And I noticed that Cardinal Casper himself described it as just ridiculous. In particular, that the voice of women will be absent from the family. I mean, if I, as President of Ireland, had called together a task force on the military, for example, and on military life, and had populated it exclusively with conscientious objectors. Exactly. People would have laughed themselves silly and said, you know, how did we come to elect such an idiot? So I have to say, I think that we are extraordinarily patient to put up with this nonsense in this day and age, and I don't think we have to. We are educated, we have voices. We can tell our church that if we want to find solutions to the major problems that are all around us, use all of the wisdom that God has put at our disposal. Distill all the wisdom. There are pockets of excellence out there. In response to the questionnaire, which frankly I found turgid and not a beautiful document, I wrote back and I said that my own direct experience as a mother and as a grandmother, that where two or more young people who have children are gathered, they are not sitting talking about the natural law, they are discussing sleep deprivation post-night. And I said that I had a question of my own, and my own question was, how many of the men who will gather, it's a rhetorical question, how many of the men who will gather in October to advise the Pope on the challenges facing the family have ever changed a child's nappy? And frankly, I regard that as a very serious issue. I think if you keep asking the same people for the same, for their answers, then you're probably going to get the same old answers. And that's my fear, that we are going to be told at the end of this synod that we are under-catechized, yes, that we need to be retaught, the doctrine remains the same, and we're all just going to be trooped into the church and we're going to be wrapped over the knuckles and told, now you'll be better students. And if that happens, well, the silent sound of creeping feet will be, it'll be a big drum roll. And that's a real worry that I have. Please God it won't be, because at the end of the day we live in hope of the Holy Spirit, but frankly the structure of the synod puts a big burden on the Holy Spirit. It could have been a lot easier. It could have been a lot easier. Anyway, relax, enjoy. Let's not get indigestion over it. We've learned to be patiently impatient, and that's what we need to be. I think intelligent, but also loving interrogators of our church. So, good to be here.
To go first, and I'd like to introduce her now. And the structure of the afternoon is each of the speakers will speak for about 15 minutes. I'll try to hold them to that. All the best, Michael. And because a lot of the goodness of these afternoons is in the interchange, and after Anne and Robert have spoken, there'll be time for you to make your own observations, stand up and muse out loud, or even ask questions. So Sister A.Derwin is the congregational leader of the Sisters of St. Joseph of the Sacred Heart from North Sydney. And you would have seen many times, I think, on television in recent months as the canonisation of St. Mary MacKillop approached and was eventually enacted in Rome, and has not long returned from Dili, where she was up there for the opening of one of the works of the Sisters of St. Joseph. And I mention that to remind you that of the kind of work the Sisters of St. Joseph do. By any measure, an extraordinary group of people made not only an immense contribution to the life of the Catholic Church in Australia, but to the life of Australia as such. And Anne says of herself that her life with the Josephite goes back to her first day at school at Regina Caeli, Beverly Hills. And from that day until she left school at the end of Year 12 at Milperra, she was educated by the sisters. And sometime during her first year at Sydney University, she walked up and down Mount Street until she had the courage to ring the doorbell and ask if she could enter the congregation. And so began the rest of her life with the Josephites. And that life has led her to many happy years in secondary education, both as a teacher and as a principal, 6 years on the Provincial Council, followed by 6 years as Provincial of New South Wales, and to administration of 2 special Josephite venues, Kincumber and Mary MacKillop Place. She now moves to her new ministry in the congregation, or she's been there for a while now. You better update your website, sister. She does so with gratitude to her sisters in the congregation who have placed the trust in her as a congregational leader. She says of the chapter of the sisters to call us forward now to set out on new pathways, to be called afresh to explore mission and identity as consecrated women religious, to structure the congregation in new ways in order to walk with those most in need of God's justice and hospitality, to recognise God's future coming to meet us. Ladies and gentlemen, would you welcome our first speaker this afternoon, Sister A.Derwin.
Yes, you can hear me? Yes. Thank you. Lovely to be here. Thank you for the invitation to be here. In my 15 minutes, I thought I'd talk a little bit about my life and about Eucharist as so central to being Catholic for me, and about the justice that is gospel living, that is also so Catholic, and about Mary MacKillop, capital C Catholic and little c Catholic. So I was in high school during the Second Vatican Council, and remember very clearly the day the Josephite principal of my school, who was also my religion teacher, literally bounced into the classroom, went straight to the blackboard and wrote in big words on the board, "The church is the people of God." She turned around with such excitement to tell us that the Vatican Council had described the church as the people of God. And she kept saying it with great delight and satisfaction in every religion lesson for the rest of the year. Imagine a 15-year-old being so taken with that moment in class that I remember it so vividly 48 years later. At 15, I think I felt the same excitement and freedom that Sister Raymond did. What a revelation for Catholics when Vatican II described the Church as the people of God, a human, living, growing, a people able to think, able to love, with freedom of conscience and freedom for the good as well as the harmful. I grew up, like many of you probably, in a family that had been Catholic forever, it seemed, generation after generation, with its strands in Irish, French and German Catholicism. The parish was certainly the focus of our family life, and Catholic practices like morning mass, evening devotions, confessions on Saturdays, even if we did go to see some of the Berry players at confession on Saturday afternoon, we went for the wrong motives. Family rosary were all part of life. Mum and Dad sent us to Catholic schools for the entirety of our school days, and there was never a thought about education that was not Catholic. So my world was totally Catholic. So going to university in 1968 after Year 12 was a big shock. It was the late 60s after all, with its flower power, free love, student demonstrations through the streets of Sydney. When I went before the Mother General and her council to ask if I would be accepted into the novitiate of the Sisters of St. Joseph, Unlike the other women with me who were asked a lot of questions, obviously to test their suitability, the Assistant Mother General simply said to the Mother General, "Anne's no problem, she's been through the wicked university and came out all right." And I wasn't asked one question. I do remember being puzzled as I tried to identify what was so wicked about the university and thinking that I'd missed out on something. My adult life as a sister of St Joseph, however, has given me many opportunities, far different from thinking university is wicked, for broadening that small Catholic world in which I grew up in. Like my Josephite sisters and other religious, I have had opportunities for education, travel, reading, listening to speakers, meeting a vast array of people from all walks of life and beliefs, undertaking courses needed to keep up the world of our ministries today. I even had to do a company director's course at one stage. People from the media even became a big part of my world for months before and after the canonisation of Mary MacAleese. And that's not a world, that's a world particularly unsympathetic to Catholic. My time in leadership of the Sisters of St Joseph has taken me to places far and wide and given me such a sense of what it means to be Catholic. To join with an Aboriginal community in the remote East Kimberley, sitting on the red earth as they gather around the table of Eucharist. To join with the people in churches full of people in East Timor as they gather around the table of Eucharist. To join with the people of Peru in their churches and little chapels up harsh stony pathways as they gather around the table of Eucharist. And to join with thousands of refugees from Burundi in a refugee camp in Tanzania as they gather around the table. Has provided me with a great sense of what it means to be Catholic. I belonged in all these Eucharistic celebrations without even being able to pray in Kidja or Tetan or Spanish or Burundi. In celebrating Eucharist amidst the music and dancing, the colour and the cultural enrichment of the celebration in those places, I found joy in identifying with those thousands of Catholics who in the main were very poor. In a basic Christian community gathering, again sitting on the ground in the refugee camp, while the people prepared for Sunday Eucharist by reading and sharing the word, I witnessed people with nothing discussing what Jesus meant by seeking out the poor. These refugees made their decision as to who were the poor in the camps. Now imagine, they were all poor, they had nothing. And they decided that what they would do in the coming week for the poorest in the camp. They identified them as the elderly and disabled who could not stand on the queue when the food rations were given out. These men and women decided they would give a third of their family's ration that week to the elderly and disabled. What better experience could I have had in understanding the transformation that Eucharist asks of us, so that we too be the bread Christ offers to the world. In these places I saw the hope that the Eucharist as source and summit of our lives, as the Vatican Council taught us, being particularly brings particularly to people who are most poor and vulnerable. After the Second Vatican Council did call Eucharist the source and summit of our lives, we're only too aware that it has been denied many in our country and across the world, because we as church have become rigid about one aspect, who is able to be presider of the Eucharistic celebration. Whether we're being with our sisters in outback towns of Australia or in listening to a young priest in Remissio a few weeks ago in the mountains of Timor, who has 12,000 in his parish, scattered around 29 chapels, the reality of Eucharist being denied the people of God is something we cannot allow to continue. I see our sisters and other good people as the gatherers of the community of faith, especially in outback towns. I love being in Quilpie earlier this year when our two Josephite sisters and two women Anglican ministers who come to Quilpie from time to time from Brisbane, these four women sitting down preparing to lead the Easter Triduum together for everyone in the town. The Catholic parish priest has a vast parish, but he cannot be everywhere even for Easter. And this in the diocese where Bishop Bill Morris no longer serves as bishop because he dared to question how we might allow the people of God their right as Catholics to source and summit of their lives. As well as Eucharist being so central for me to be a Catholic, also means to belong to a church motivated by a rich social teaching, a church made up of many groups and organisations who do incredible work for justice, who care for the vulnerable and the left out in society. who are present with people who suffer and stand in solidarity with the oppressed. To me, to be Catholic means to identify with this part of our global church and to be grateful that in Australia, our Catholic Church provides over 500 social services. It's the largest provider of trained personnel to work in the developing world. Where Caritas in our church is the 4th largest development agency in our country. Where we have a Catholic education system forming millions of young people in the way of Jesus, and a Catholic health system bringing the healing ministry of Christ to so many people every day across this nation. For me, to be a Catholic is to aim that the opposite to justice is also part of us. That injustice has happened in our name and continues to happen. As a people of God, we have the best of humanity and the worst of humanity in us. The injustice we know is in abuse, in exclusion of people for reasons of sexuality, inequality of women, the language that limits God to male and excludes women and is meaningless to some people, the denial of the voice of the people, and the lack of real nourishment, spiritual nourishment, and our tendency to be certain and rigid and legalistic, to put rules and regulations before the needs of people. And this, as Catholics, we must all take responsibility for, and we must keep voicing and addressing the issues. And I know Catalyst for Renewal has been a wonderful group in taking that responsibility seriously. I belong to a wonderful congregation. We are blessed in wonderful women scattered all around this country, New Zealand, East Timor, Peru, Brazil, Scotland and Ireland. Mostly their ministries are well and truly inserted in the Catholic Church. We are blessed in a foundress whose identity was certainly Catholic and who lived a life that was small c Catholic, totally universal in her thinking, her actions, her inclusivity, her conviction that the compassionate love of God was abounding was for everyone. From her day to this, her sisters were for everyone without distinction. In country towns and suburbs, in developing countries and developed cities, our sisters witnessed to me that Catholic means being present, being the compassionate face of Christ for everyone. The thing I love best about the canonisation of Mary McAleese was that her way of being for everyone and drawing everyone into the love of God was reflected in that event in 2010. It seemed unlikely that a Vatican event, with all its pomp and ceremony, all its gold, all its important characters being men, would attract the attention of the media and be given so much attention in secular Australia. Here, what the world outside Catholicism sees as the essence or height of Catholicism was actually being broadcast in a good light. It was obvious that our country saw Mary McAleese as a woman of Catholicism, and in her they see the best of what it means to be Catholic. To be Catholic is to be inclusive. In the canonisation, all sorts of people, Catholics, Christians, people of other faiths, people of no faith, felt included. Mary McAleese has that ability for inclusion. I marvelled at how those in our own tradition felt they were part of it, no matter where they stood. Conservative, traditional Catholic, Catholics who see themselves on the other end of the scale, and in all the places in between. Everyone seemed to find a place. And that inclusivity being such a key characteristic of our first saint. So in conclusion, how am I going, Michael?
Very well.
I began with my learning as a 15-year-old that to be Catholic is to be the people of God. Incredible developments in the world in the last 50 years have led me to see that to be Catholic is to be part of a people of God among all the other peoples of God. To be part of a people of God who are first and foremost committed followers of Jesus, with a tradition that is rich in so many ways, and with the potential for a future that speaks to the world of its inclusiveness, its meaningful spiritual nourishment, and its service of the most vulnerable. That's what I hope to be Catholic into the future. And I'm very happy being Catholic and knowing that actually the Holy Spirit's in charge.
Marvellous. Wonderful. Robert Fitzgerald, Chair Designate of the Australian Charities and Non-Profits Commission, Commissioner for Productivity Commission, and Adjunct Professor at Australian Catholic University. Robert is a commercial lawyer by profession, has had very extensive experience in law, commerce, public and community services and numerous Catholic agencies. He has over 30 years voluntary involvement in the community services sector, including previously as National President of the Australian Council of Social Services, Chair of the National Roundtable of Non-Profit Organisations, and numerous Catholic agencies, including State President of the St Vincent de Paul Society, New South Wales, Commissioner, Catholic Employment Relations Commission, and member of the National Committee of Caritas Australia. Robert is a patron of Catalyst for Renewal and McAleese Family Services. Robert was appointed as a full-time commissioner with the Productivity Commission in 2004. He was formerly Community and Disability Services Commissioner and Deputy Ombudsman in New South Wales. He has recently been appointed by the Australian Government as the Chair of the Advisory Board, Australian Charities and Not-for-Profit Commission. Robert holds degrees in Law and Commerce from the University of New South Wales and was made a member of the Order of Australia in 1994. He holds an honorary doctorate from the Australian Catholic University and is an adjunct professor at that university. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Robert Fitzgerald.
That sounds very exhausting to me, and I'm sure it is to you too. Look, it's a great joy to be here. I was just reflecting with Anne and Michael that it's 10 years ago, almost to the day, sometime around this time, that we celebrated the 40th anniversary of Vatican II. And at that stage, the seminar was called Unfinished Business. And it seems like only a moment's gone by since that time. But the truth of the matter is that Vatican II, as you are well aware, is and still remains an unfinished business for all of us. Sometimes I describe it as an unfulfilled promise. And I suspect that's the way that I see it. It's a promise that is yet to be fully realised in our own lives and the lives of the Church. But one of the things about the Vatican II was the notion of the signs of the times, the reading the signs of the times. And some of you may have heard me recount this recently. There was a nun from overseas addressing a Catholic Education Forum in Adelaide last year, which I was also attending. And she spoke of this United Kingdom Home Affairs Minister who liked the drink very much. He often got tippled. And he was on a special tour to Peru and came to dinner. He was seated next to somebody resplendent in a red and white outfit. And of course the drinks came and he continued to drink heavily. The music started up and he turned to the guest next to him and said, would you like to dance? And the person said, no, and there's three reasons. The first is you're drunk, the second it's the national anthem of Peru, and thirdly, I happen to be the Archbishop of Lima. So, for those that are dressed eloquently, be very careful in reading the signs of the times. And I think I've been reading the signs of the times with Michael and others in this room for a very long time. And frankly, I think a drink every so often wouldn't do any harm. I was just reflecting that Anne and Michael's introduction talked about Mary McAleese Museum. And I was asked to open an art exhibition there some years ago. It was an art exhibition put on by McAleese Family Services, which now has their main services in Melbourne, but also outreach into Sydney. And these are paintings that were done by young people who are in out-of-home care, in foster care, in residential care, who are no longer able to live with their parents. And one of the paintings, a very stark painting, a very confronting painting, was done by a teenage girl. And she asked the question, what would have happened if Romeo hadn't fallen in love with Juliet? And it's a lovely expression. For her, it was all the what-ifs in her life. If all of the decisions had been different, what if? And today, maybe, instead of just talking about what does being Catholic mean to me, we could contemplate what it would be like if we weren't Catholic. And sometimes looking at it in the other way is extraordinary. Because for me, like Anne and others, I can't imagine not being Catholic. And I've never not been Catholic. But if it is so important to us, what would be the difference if it ceased to be so? If we ceased to be Catholic? And many have chosen that course. Friends and families and others that we know only so well. Now, it's not a strange question, because I remember when I started off at the University of New South Wales, in the first few weeks, these people come up to you and they say to you, are you Christian? And I say, oh yes, I'm Catholic. They say, no, are you Christian? And I say, that's a bit odd. And I say, no, I'm Catholic, I've always been Catholic. And they say, haven't you been born again? And I always thought being born once was enough effort the first time around. But today, you know, I think they're right. Because the truth of the matter is, we always enter this topic as to why I'm Catholic or why I'm meant, what it means to be Catholic. But the reality is, the first question is, what does it mean to believe in God? And what is that notion of God in our lives? To me, it is a God that is both the creator, and you used a lovely expression about the Eucharist, the source and summit of our existence. And in a sense, for me, that is God. This is not a God that intervenes in the day-to-day activities of our world, nor is it a God that in any way stops the evolution of our planet and of our people and of each other's. It's a God that is there as creator, but also a God there of infinite love. But is that enough? Well, the answer is no, because then I can say, well, what does it mean to be Christian? Why can't I just believe in God? And for me, it is that absolute belief, and it has never been shaken, that belief in the birth, the life, the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And all of that means, for me, it is central to my life and my well-being. It is very much me. And that has never been that has never diminished despite aspects of church. In many sense, being Christian is central to what we're about. But why isn't that good enough? Why can't I believe in God and now I believe in Christ? And now I say, well, why am I Catholic? Or what does it mean to be Catholic? To some extent, that is a challenge for the church today. For the greatest challenge of church is to bring us closer to God through Christ. And sometimes it appears to me today that I, as part of the people of God, as the church, have in fact failing very miserably in that task. In some senses, the end point seems to be the protection of the church as institution. And of course that cannot be. It's only a means to an end. It's a means to an end by which my belief in God, by faith in Jesus Christ, is developed further. And when it ceases to do so, then it has ceased in its very mission and foundations. Very briefly, I suppose, like Anne, the early days always shape what it means to be. I remember my first communion. My first communion was before the Vatican II, and it was those periods where we had the Black Josephites, who were very stern, let me assure you, and it was a very dark church. And I also remember the communion as both things, which reflects on church. The first is absolute fear, because the one thing I remember to this day is the fear of dropping the host off the mouth. Well, my God, the world was going to end. The nuns went on and on and on and on, and if the host touched the ground, hell would come forward. And yet at the other time, it was one of joy, of celebration. And that was the church we had, one of fear, and I hope one of celebration. And it reflected that time of church. We can talk about what it was like back then. And then I remember coming to Forestville, a parish out towards the beaches, and I used to live in Canterbury, in Doouge Hill. And there was a church that had embraced the Second Vatican Council. And it was a church, a magnificent church. The commissioners actually built the church and the school brick by brick. Actual parishioners, men and women, all joining together. It was a church of celebration. It was packed Sunday after Sunday. And it was the Vatican II alive and well with laity very much involved. Until the parish priest took a trip, and I'm very cautious of priests going to trips, to Europe. And he came back, and from that moment on, all the world changed. He started to dismantle all of the structures for laity. And the church went from having 500 or 600 per mass to 70 or 80. The conservatives in the parish flourished, all 70 of them. And they loved it. And the church absolutely collapsed. But like church, did it seek to solve the problem? No, not at all. It split the parish in two, created a new parish. Everyone went to the second parish and this problem was solved. But it wasn't solved. Now, I've seen the future of those that believe in a smaller, purer church. I've seen the future, and I won't go there. I will not go to a church that in fact is prepared to alienate its majority, to throw out that which was good in Vatican II, for the wishes or desires of others. I won't go there. Because I know what it is like, and I know the destructive force relative to the force of good that can become, that has come out of Vatican II. Third one is through Vinnies. I've had a lifetime involvement in Vinnies. And here is a human organisation with all the frailties of human organisations writ large. And yet at its heart, it has this joy and love of people that are disadvantaged and marginalised in our community. And the Vincentian spirituality is one that says Christ is present in each of us, including those on the margins, those that are disadvantaged, those that are homeless. And our task is not to bring Christ to them. Rather, it is to allow them to see Christ in their own lives. It is to bring Christ alive in their circumstances. And whether we do a good or poor job of that is up for debate. But that was something very special. And the last one has been Catalyst for Renewal. This extraordinary conversation that has gone on for so long has become very much part of my life. Not because I'm on the organising committee, God help us, but it's because I've had the opportunity to speak to hundreds, if not thousands now, of people like myself, to listen to them, to converse with them. And this has been an extraordinary moment in church. And what do we see the same? We see the joy and the aspiration for something great and glorious, but we also see the pain and suffering in those communities as we go forward. Let me just be brief. At the Catalyst dinner a couple of months ago, it seems like that's probably longer than that, I spoke about a church that had two parts. One, a silent revolution in which people were leaving, and they are. And the other revolution of the church is one that has embraced laity, men and women in equal terms, and that we see in education, in community services, in international development, in health and so on. These two are happening at the same time. But I've made a choice that I don't want to be part of the silent revolution that simply walks out and leaves. They don't argue, they don't create a fuss, they just leave. Well, I'm very clear I don't want to be part of that silent revolution. I want to be part of that church with a positive revolution, something extraordinarily good. And it's unusual, or almost coincidental actually today, that we learn of the death of the commander of the Apollo 11 mission to the moon. And I was going to talk to you just briefly about this thing, the Apollo 13 mission. And in that mission there was a moment when everything went wrong, a catastrophic failure, which would determine whether or not that particular group could come back to Earth. And at a point, error signals were coming back saying the systems have completely failed. And the commander, Jim Lovell, at the time made a decision that he would stop looking at all the negative, all the things that were telling him what was wrong, and he would see what he actually had to fly with. That same incident happened for Richard de Caspian, who was the pilot of the A380 Qantas flight a couple of years ago in 2010, that also had an explosion 4 minutes after takeoff. And he said there were 120 messages telling him what was wrong in the plane. He said the only way that I could survive was to try to work out what was right, what was working. And he said I could gradually reconstruct the data to find out that yes, I had a plane and the plane would fly. I think that's where I'm at with church. Not to deny the failures and the flaws, God help me, I'm never going to do that. And not to articulate the need for very substantial change in the way the church operates. But I am comforted in this church. I'm comforted by being part of a community or a tribe in the traditions of the earlier church. I am reassured by the familiarity of the rituals wherever I go. And I recognise what is Catholic, the tenets of our faith, the thoughtful discernment of our theologians. I am enthused yet challenged by the social teachings and commitment to social justice and action. I am inspired by the commitment of our religious, both men and women, to a life of dedication and devotion. I am nourished by the sacraments and the gift of grace. And I believe my optimism is based on the fact that the church has always been capable of change, and it is no less so today. But to be honest, to conclude, to stay Catholic, however, three things must be present for me. And they are taken from Micah, well pre-Christ, when he said to act with justice, to love with tenderness, to walk with humility with our God. Justice, love and humility. For me to remain Catholic, I must be able to find justice in the church. A justice not preached just to those outside of church, for that we see in rich amounts. But it must be where we see justice to women, justice to those that have left religious and ordained ministry, justice to those that have divorced, justice that live a life on the margins within church. I must see that, for it is fundamental to being a believer in God, to being a believer in Christ, and to being Catholic. Second, I must find love. Love in the relationships that are at the core of this church, the community that we've talked about. Without love in those relationships, this is no church that I wish to be part of. And yet I know that love does exist. It exists in this room, and it exists in so many of the relationships that I have, as it exists in the centre of the relationship with God and Jesus Christ. But the love must be present. Recently I was visiting an aged care facility for homeless men in Woolloomooloo in Sydney. It's actually a service that I started when I stayed president of Vinnie's many years ago. And a man on the street had recently died, and he was quite well known amongst that fraternity. The manager said to me something quite extreme. He said to me, he started to talk about this man's heroic life. He talked of how this man had inspired him, who had lived his life on the streets. And then he said, and I have grown to love him. And at that moment, it all makes sense. It's not running services for homeless persons or anything else. It is because we wish to grow in love with those men and women. And so too we must see it within church. And lastly, where is the humility of church? Can I put it another way? Where is the Bethlehem in church today? And this came to me on the funeral of John Paul II and the, not coronation, what is it, the commissioning of the Pope, the current Pope Benedict XVI. And I looked at those scenes and I was astonished by the public attention. I was extraordinarily impressed by the grandeur, until I thought, where is Bethlehem? Where is the simplicity, the humility of Jesus Christ present in these services? Or much of the things I see in church. It's not to say that I don't believe in ritual. It is not to condemn the church that sits above us, a magnificent church, a tribute to God and to his people. But it is to say this church must find and have within its heart the humility. And to me it is that Bethlehem scene. And if we can't find it, we must go in search of it and recreate it. Let me conclude also, obviously, by the statement that Anne has made about the people of God. For me, this has been all of my life, with the exception of those first few years. And I value it very much. But it's not enough. For we must also be part of the body of Christ. And the current Pope said this just a few years ago, although you never see much about some of his statements. He said this: while people of God expresses the continuity of the history of the church, body of Christ expresses the universality inaugurated on the cross and with the resurrection of the Lord. In Christ we become really the people of God, from the Pope to the last child. The church, therefore, is not the result of the sum of its individuals, but a unity amongst those who are nourished by the Word of God and the bread of life. And so for me, to be Catholic is to be part of the people of God, but hopefully, if I'm worthy, to be part of the body of Christ. Thank you.
How about we take until past, just to have a buzz, and then we open it up for comment or question. Okay, we reconvene at past.
Thank you. We've just been talking here about something that I heard yesterday for the first time. I'm going to these things about Vatican II and what's going on about Vatican II. And yesterday we understood Vatican II finished in 65, and then it lasted only about 3 years, the relevance of Vatican II, because the world changed in 1968. 1968, the wicked universities, the students revolted against the lecturers. In 1968, here in Australia, Humane Vitae. What happened? The people revolted against it. So what I'm saying is it looks as though the world has changed. And are we going to expect another Vatican III?
Well, I'd hold back on the Vatican III until I knew who was going to be there. I'm all for democracy, but, and so that's it. Look, you're absolutely right about this issue. Can I just relate it? A fundamental change took place in Australian society in the 60s and 70s, and it's reflected in a number of areas. If you just think about it for a moment, this formed the generation that doesn't, that's my generation, the baby boom generation, that doesn't belong to anything. It doesn't join. And its children don't join either. The second thing is every single institution in the Western world, including in Australia, fell out of favour progressively since that time. All of the mainstream churches lost members. some people in the church say, oh, you know, I heard the other day ridiculous nonsense that the Vatican II was the cause of where we are today. If that was true, there must have been Vaticans happening everywhere around the world, because there was a seismic and substantial change in the population. Now, I don't quite know why, and I don't know how it evidenced itself, but it's very true. And we're living that legacy today. The second thing in relation to Vatican II, the reason it didn't sustain itself in the Catholic Church is that the structures of power and privilege were never changed. At the end of the day, the one thing I've learned about Vatican II, but I also learned it in Vinnie's and other areas, is you can change the hearts and minds of people, but you must also change the structures, and in church that's about privilege and power. And if you fail to do both, it will not work. Now, over time it might, and we are seeing reasons for optimism at the moment, but very minor ones. But that was the great challenge in church, that the things that underpin never got changed. And that is the big lesson. You can change the hearts and minds, but you must also change the structures. Otherwise, it is not likely to be long-lasting.
He's a wise man.
It's on, indeed.
In the 60s and 70s, the religious education programs underwent a great change. I was principal in Queensland, where the changes came last. Sorry about that. You could teach all or nothing with regard to morals or ethics, as prescribed by the Department of Religious Education. The books were flossy and feathery. There was no really morality taught to the young people. The teachers that I inherited were very ignorant of basic facts about the unity and Trinity of God, the incarnation, death and resurrection of our Saviour. They didn't even know the meaning of some of the terms. And I think this has been a great fallout in the church, that the teachers don't know what to teach, and the children today are very ignorant of morality.
Having been a teacher of religion in the 70s, I think all of us would agree it was a complete backlash from the earlier times when morals and everything else were rammed down the children's necks. And I do agree with you that the 70s, and teaching there ourselves, it did become very different. But I do think that's swung around again now. I do think there's a lot of solid depth in the religious education programs. I think our teachers are much better educated today in theology, in morality, in many things. So I think we've come back to a balance. I haven't been actually in schools myself for a little while, but from what I understand of what's going on in schools and what I see of religious education programs, I think, yes, we swung in the 70s, but I believe it's come back. Not that way. I hope it doesn't go back to when I was a child, but I think it's come back to more of a balance. But people here might be more familiar with what's happening now.
Can I just make a very brief comment? One is, I think we need to start to think about a concept that I'm thinking through. I've got a talk to the Christian Brothers in a few weeks' time. All their schools, they've got about 48 around the countryside. And this is a notion of spiritual resilience. One of the fundamental principles underpinning primary school education and secondary school education is the building of resilience within young people. It's not a new novel concept, but it's taken centre stage. And one of the critical issues is, how do we build spiritual resilience into young people? Not Catholicism. It is actually more fundamental than that, because most young people have a deep quest for the spiritual in some way, shape or form. But it gets battered out of them by the time they leave school, and completely battered by the time they're in universities. And so how do we build that in as we go through? It's not that the young people today don't have that spiritual dimension, but it is of a different nature. The second and greatest challenge for Catholic schools is not spirituality, it is trying to convert that into a love of the sacraments, a sacramental life. Now, I have 3 children, all of whom went to Mass every single Sunday until they turned 18 or 19. The one thing I failed, despite all of that, and they've all gone to Catholic schools, and that is, I don't think yet they have a love of the sacrament. Now, I don't know why that is. So the 2 challenges, spiritual resilience, and then how do we convert that into a love of the sacramental life, which I think is a really special challenge. And it is at the centre of the Catholic faith, and it is different from most other Christian and other faiths. It's the unique thing that we have.
Oops. This has really started out as two questions, listening to Anne, and then she answered it right at the end. So just for general interest, when she spoke about the church is the people of God, and I thought, now, question one, who owns God? And two, are the people of God beyond the boundaries of religion? And then right at the end, when you're summarising, you spoke of a people of God. I often, as a Catholic, I wasn't born a Catholic, but as a Catholic, I've often been troubled as to about we think we own God. When Jesus wasn't a Catholic.
Program said that other people other than Catholics could go to heaven, so I was reassured, I have to say. But I have this view about the old the old Australian homestead, and the old traditional homestead has doors running from the bedrooms onto the verandas. And I now have this view, not only is heaven got many rooms, it actually has many doorways. And I think it's a very Australian seed. So I'm now convinced that you may have to get onto the property, but once you're there, you can find your way in through a number of doorways, and maybe that works better.
I'd like to make a comment about your article in the Record regarding reimagining our visitations, I think it was called.
Yeah, for Vinnie's, yep.
Yes, for Vinnie's. Well, I would like to tell you that our conference took that fairly seriously and digested it fairly well, and as a result of that, we are going into the, not rewarding, but treating people who are frequent callers on special occasions. And in fact, one lady we invited out to coffee and asked her where she'd like to go, and she had never been out for coffee. And other people's birthdays and hairdos and things. So thank you very much for that.
Well, that's very encouraging. Thank you very much. Nice to get that feedback.
Is to where, Robert, you're getting your hope from. For us, for many of us here, the great thing about the Catholic Church is the social justice and its activity and welfare, where the good women and men all around the world and in Australia are running hospitals, education, drop-in centres, drug rehabilitation, halfway houses for kids that are coming out of borstals, and speaking out on behalf of the poor and disadvantaged when all the problems about poverty in Australia could be fixed. All it needs is a cooperative working relationship between the state and federal governments. It's unlikely to do, but I don't hear any of the bishops speaking out about that. And that's where my hope loses. I went to the Catholic Historical Society recently, and they were talking about the changes that had taken place after Goulburn. I would have liked to have pointed out to them there was no Bishop Metropolitan involved in any of that. And in fact, I've never known a Bishop Metropolitan other than Danny Mannix to ever get involved in anything related to social justice or welfare and that organisation. And without that leadership, I don't think that the excitement we all had after Vatican II, where we went to Casillo's and the Catholic organisation was working and there was all sorts of family movements and meetings and was all enthusiastic. I don't see that enthusiasm. And the second thing is, if you go to churches around that I've been to, admittedly I come from a middle-class suburb in Lane Cove, I don't see many people, young people, in it, and there are certainly no young people in the St Vincent de Paul Society in the northern regions of Sydney.
No, well, if I can just make a couple of comments, and then Anne no doubt would. The optimism comes in two ways. The first thing is, historically, the church has been capable of extraordinary change, and there were quotes that I had, which I haven't used, which reflect just in the last 100 years. The quotes of popes at the beginning, the end of the 1800s, early 1900s, And the quotes and the actual canon law that came after Vatican II, the language is entirely different, but so too is the whole theology and the theological approach. So we've seen change all the time. The Church is capable of remarkable change. Here in this very suburb, we saw a church that was founded in the laity. When the First Fleet came here, there were no priests, brothers or nuns for a very long period of time. The church existed in the hearts and minds and the spirits of the laity. And yet it was then to become a parish-based church. And Edmund Campion talks about it. The question for us is not whether the church will survive, but what will it look like? It was the frontier church. It then became the parish church. And now we have to, as the people of God, shape it in a new way. And we are capable of doing that in this place. The third point and the last point that I'd make is part of church is doing very well, terrifically well. The parts you've described, the parts that Anne described. Now they are church. There are tens of thousands of young people in church every time they go to the Catholic schools. They are exposed to wonderful teachings, good people, and yes, the sacramental programs. They are church. Today in Australia, more people are touched on a daily basis by the church than at any other time in its history. They just don't happen to be going to Mass on Sundays. And that is an issue, a serious issue. But can I just, and I'm not trying to be half full, half empty, the truth is the church has some extraordinary things happening in it of which we should celebrate and learn from. It also has another side where we are in deep and dark times. But we can take hope from one part. We can do that if we wish to.
Yes, just to add, I guess it's the hope of the resurrection that we cling on to always, isn't it? In every aspect of our life and church. And as I said, it's God's church. God's going to lead it. The church, what is it? God has the church. The church doesn't have God. God has the church as one instrument in this world.
I can just add a mention of Catholic priests in Warrnambool. He said 1/3 of the healthcare throughout the world is conducted by Catholic Church agencies. That's phenomenal.
And all begun by women, or 99.9%. I was going to say another little fact when you talked about the Vatican III. Earlier this year, once a year, the religious leaders are invited to the Bishops' Conference for a morning, and we have some topic of dialogue. We've tried to get facilitated dialogue, sometimes we work. But actually, I have to say last year it was all just at the time that Bishop Morris was being retired. And so on behalf of Catholic Religious Australia, I spoke to Archbishop Wilson, who was in charge of the Bishops' Conference, and said, can we suspend the topic for Saturday and can we discuss this? And to their credit, they said yes. They gave us the whole morning, and the bishop said, we want to hear from the religious what they think about it. So I have to say there are signs of hope. And during the week at their meetings when I was present, they were referring back to remember when the religious said this about the people in Toowoomba, and remember. So, there are little signs of hope. But last time we had a priest speaking about Vatican II and the spirit John the 23rd brought to the Vatican Council, and it was a great talk. But he just made one little slip at the end because he told us that the image for him that is so powerful about the Vatican was all these hundreds of clerics lining up, walking in, dressed up. And here he was speaking to half a room full of women. So when we said, Robert said, I hope there won't be a Vatican III. There won't be one like that, you can be sure.
Okay.
And it's degrading the church. Over the weekend there was an article written by this fellow who went to Catholic school and really everything was just wrong for him. And as well as the atheists and the agnostics, they're all getting their share of the publicity. Haven't we got enough Christians to be journalists?
Well, there's an awful lot of Christians that are journalists, but they get a bit of a sort of a feeding pack mentality that takes over, and we've seen that right throughout history. Can I just make the comment, the way to respond to that is to in fact do what we do better, to reduce the areas where people can attack, and that is not to close the wagons, The danger for the church at the moment is it's about to close the wagons further, become tighter, become more centralised, become more conservative, and that will be to its ruin. The approach is to open up and go the reverse. The approach is to be fair dinkum about the problems and what have you in the church. But can I just take sexual abuse for a moment? And I don't want to talk about the sexual aspect, but that is about power. Until such time as the church deals with the granting of and exercise of power, then we won't deal with it. And that is at the heart of so much. And so if we don't actually start to deal with those fundamental issues, we are going to continue to be open for attack. The response is not to attack the journalists. The response is to say, we hear those messages, and this is what we're doing in response after appropriate discernment. And I don't think people believe that those responses are there yet. Yes, we are handling the abuse better. We are not handling the causes any better. And until we do, now that's only one example of many. The second one is the shortage of priests. If you ask the wrong question, you get the wrong answer. If you believe the future of the church rests in getting more priests, you will ask the wrong question. If you say, how can we use the people of God, the body of Christ, to in fact enhance and benefit the church, you get a very different answer. So again, in that area, we've got to start to ask the right questions and get the right answers. And then the rest of the world will start to see that happen.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Cometh the hour, cometh the man. Frank. Deirdre just said, thank goodness.
I had to keep talking.
Well, thank you. Good idea, Deirdre.
Deirdre has asked to speak first.
Sure,
okay.
Of course.
And we're doing the digital recording.
Sure.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're very sorry about the seating, but we don't have any more seats, so make yourself as comfortable as you can. A few preliminary notes. The little pamphlet that we put out to accompany the Q&A each week on the Second Vatican Council, if you didn't get a copy, it is available on the Catalyst website, and it is also available on the Aquinas Academy website. This particular week I've taken excerpts from Father John O'Malley, SJ, his book, his article, What Happened? Did Anything Happen at the Second Vatican Council? If you want a concise, scholarly, excellent summary to respond to that question, that article is it. We do have some copies of the full article down there. An essay was published in Theological Studies a few years ago. It's available for $5 on the back table with other booklets. I draw your attention also to October the 11th, which is the actual date on which the Second Vatican Council began in 1962. We are having a Mass here, celebratory Mass upstairs at 6:30. Bishop Geoffrey Robinson will be the principal celebrant and homilist. We come down here afterwards, after the Mass, and have conviviality, wine and cheese, at which point we will also launch Jeff Robinson's latest book on St. Luke's Gospel. And he's asked Bishop David Crammon to launch it for him. So I think that'll be a wonderful celebratory evening. Deirdre has asked to speak first this afternoon, and she assures me she's very nervous, and I don't believe her. She hardly needs introduction, but let me read something of, just a little bit of her CV. She was a member of the New South Wales Parliament for 25 years. She was born Deirdre Mary Brereton in Sydney, and is the sister of Laurie Brereton.
Now he's my brother.
Well, not according to this. And this initially elected to the New South Wales Legislative Council in 1978. She remained in office until 1990, and during this time she was Minister for Consumer Affairs and Assistant Minister for Health 1986-1988, and Minister for Small Business 1987-1988. In 1990 she ran in a by-election in Heffron, winning a seat in the New South Wales Legislative Assembly. She was re-elected in 1991, 1995 and 1999. I think, Deirdre, you also sit on more than one board. You're certainly the Catholic Care. Deirdre is well known for a lot of things that aren't mentioned there, one of which is she's a very active supporter of Catalyst for Renewal. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Deirdre Grusin.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's good to be here with you. Excuse me. Yes. Sorry, I've got one here. Oh, have I got to turn it on?
Would you mind holding this?
No.
Instead?
No.
Okay.
I'm happy to do that.
Let me unpin that.
You don't need that. Just take that.
Sorry. Whoops.
It's on.
You're on.
Sorry about the slow start. I did think about speaking first or second because I had noticed on the other Catalyst occasions I'd been here for Q&A that it was mostly the females who went first, and then I thought, I'm not in favour of affirmative action. I hope it's not just because everyone's being polite because we're women that we speak first, because I never believed in affirmative action. I always believed in, you were judged on your abilities. Sorry, you were judged on your abilities and et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, then I thought, it's Frank Brennan. He'd be a very hard act to follow. So I'm going first. I'm here to talk about what does it mean to you to be a Catholic. I want to go back to show you, I want to go back to where we came from. We grew up in a home which became increasingly crowded as 5 children arrived. And following the death of our grandfather Brereton, the arrival of our grandmother and our father's sister, Molly, Auntie Molly. Our dad's family were very Catholic. Dad's father was one of 10 children, boys schooled at St Stan's and St Joseph's, one of whom, Sam, was the first Australian to become a Passionist priest and superior of St Mary's Passionist Monastery in Goulburn. His name was Father Leonard in religion. Our mother, Jessie Collis, had been brought up in the Church of England and schooled at North Sydney Girls High, a Sunday school teacher, and to boot with a father of Jewish origin from a Cockney Jewish family who had come to Australia from England in the early 1840s. Jessie had taught Sunday school and was a girl guide. She and our father met in the years of the Depression. She was a seamstress extraordinaire who was able to support her family during these years of extreme hardship. Her family were not very fussed about her meeting a Catholic, and his family were not very fussed about a C of E. She knew it wouldn't work if she didn't embrace Catholicism, but she was not going to convert unless she believed. It took 6 years, and she then married our father at St Mary's Cathedral. That was to show her family that this wasn't a behind-the-scenes sacristy marriage. She, of course, after long instruction, now knew far more about the Catholic faith than most of her in-laws. Many years later, after Vatican II, a number of meetings were held with parishioners at Kensington by Father Orb Collins, MSc, to talk about the changes coming in the church. Our mother proclaimed, after the meeting, "It wouldn't have taken me 6 years to decide if it had been post-Vatican II," and she meant it. Near the end of her life, she was asked if she had accepted all of Catholic teaching. She did say, and this was in her 88th year, not long before she died, she did say there were 1 or 2 things she just put to one side at the time of her conversion. And from the beginning right through to the end, there was a running tension, a frisson between Auntie Molly, Grandma while she lived with us for 12 years before she died, and our mother. Auntie Molly never quite put their differences aside. She would not exactly have been a friend of my mother's, except my mother married her brother. And she would say of our mother sometimes things like, "Well, of course, we don't like the same things. We're not the same bloodstream, you know." And on 1 or 2 occasions, well, of course, your mother brought the nose into the family, but no money, in reference to her Jewish heritage. But they lived for many years together in the house after our dad died, and they managed. The Irish Catholic pre-Vatican II Church of our youth was highly organised and regimented. You might say we had lots of extras that you don't have today. Auntie Molly made sure we got to confession on Saturday afternoon, were dressed in our finest for Sunday Mass. There was Friday benediction, the 9 First Fridays in our red cloaks, the 5 First Saturdays, which got you extra silver stars on Our Lady's banner. There were processions. We were flower strewers for Easter ceremonies in Corpus Christi. There was Children of Mary in our blue cloaks, and there were other sodality masses. There were First Communions and confirmations, and then there were indulgences. Sins of commission were the focus. There was not much emphasis on sins of omission. In third class primary school, I and my class, one of whom is here today, Mary, she must remember this, spent our lunch times with Sister Madeline teaching us how to learn the Latin Mass, which we sang at Easter that year, and we did it very well. Our father was scarcely home of an evening after the family dinner. Between meetings of the Holy Name Society, St Vincent de Paul, church wardens, and 2 other organisations mentioned only furtively by the female elders, Knights of the Southern Cross and Dr. Paddy Ryan's MSc, the movement, which was developing a core of Catholic resistance to communism, especially in the trade union movement. These Catholic trade unionists formed the backbone of the industrial groups, which returned a number of unions from communist control. Not going any further with the groups or anything else, because then some other things started to happen. Now, in those days, quite frequently, a car would pull up at our home. Usually it was late afternoon when he arrived. Not many people owned a car in those days, certainly we didn't. This was a little grey Austin that used to pull up out the front. And if we were playing out there and saw him coming, we would run to the back kitchen door to announce to our mother that the angel of death was there. In solemn voice, he would announce that a parishioner had died. Tell Tom there will be a rosary at the church tonight, and the requiem will be whenever it was set down. That man was Vince McGuinness. He's now in his mid-90s. We mostly see him at funerals. We only told him in recent years about being named the angel of death. I know he loves it. On a couple of occasions, he came into my office and I wasn't there, and he said, "I'll just leave her a message. Tell her the AOD called." Our father, then there was the Labor Party. Our father was president of the Kensington Labour League, as it was then known, a position he held for 30 years until his death in 1982. And we were exposed to the big and small issues of the day from an early age. There was always vigorous argument and debate at our kitchen table at the 6 p.m. evening meal. You did not answer back, and you did not leave till you were excused. In essence, we really had 2 religions proselytised at the table, the Catholic Church and the Australian Labor Party. And sometimes we weren't sure which had priority. What we are sure of now is that they are both in deep trouble. Great emphasis was placed on issues of social justice and the responsibility of each individual to be a contributing member to society. My sister Grant reminded us in recent times that Dad was passionately convinced that people had a responsibility to do something and not just talk about it. Emphasis was always on your responsibility to the community and church, to involve yourself, not just complain about inadequacies. If you felt your local representation in government was not doing a good job, get involved, get better representation. Our father had no personal political ambition. He just wanted to ensure the right people were in the job. I have to tell you, he was Lionel Bowen's campaign director when Lionel first entered public life at Randwick Council and in 1951 became mayor. We all attended Our Lady of the Rosary Primary School. The Olsh nuns had come to play an important role in our lives. Sister Mary de Chantal, the principal of OLR Primary School in our day, played a very important role in giving support and care to our family in so many ways, and to our mother, because sometimes it was very difficult with grandma's aunties, 5 children and a husband in the same house. It's not a very big house, I have to tell you. And she was always available to help Sister when she needed help. I shall never forget her making the green Hessian curtains for the stage in our church hall for the end of year concert. Don't know how she did it on her old Singer treble sewing machine. We 3 girls proceeded to the college, where the sisters continued to provide us with wonderful role models. Here were women with religious commitment teaching us, but also running a congregation, which was building, staffing and enlarging schools, running hospitals, a leprosarium, as well as conducting missions in the Northern Territory, the 5 Islands, Papua New Guinea, and the then named Gilbert Islands, now as Kiribati. These were women with management and financial skills, undertaking great responsibilities at a time when a young woman's normal expectation was to find an occupation until marriage and children relegated one to the role of housewife and mother. However, nothing in life is perfect. Our first year class of 53 students was the largest in the college's history. In our final year, we were down to 14. Still the largest graduation class in the history of the college, and a dramatic improvement on the previous year's class of 3. However, of our 14, only 3 were to go to university. University entry was discouraged by the sisters, who preferred to guide the majority into acceptable and ladylike professions of teaching and nursing. Sydney University was thought to be a very dangerous place, especially for anyone coming under the influence of Professor John Anderson, the philosopher. The sisters considered him to be pagan. Sister Teresia proclaimed him to be a pagan. There was a sense of the church as a family. Some today would say it was more like living in a cult or a ghetto, because we didn't mix with too many other people. We had the pastoral care of our priests and sisters. Our parish priest in the early days was Monsignor McAleese, later Vicar General in Sydney, an Irishman who'd been chaplain to our troops at Gallipoli. He'd said the first Mass on the battlefield, and we proudly had the picture of that Mass being held in our school hall. The church he built at Kensington on his return from World War I was a copy of a church he'd come across on the battlefields of France. It was a time when priests were plentiful and churches had curates. Our home was a frequent destination, especially on Saturday nights when there were very serious chess matches, and I must say drafts started the thing off, but then they went to chess with our curates, dad and friends. One of those priests was to become a part of our family, sharing so many memorable events. We were privileged to be at the celebration of his Diamond Jubilee of ordination recently. I must tell you about a life-changing happening that happened on the 25th of October 1952, when our entire family accompanied Joy Reynolds and her mother to Subiaco, Rydalmere, where that day Joy was finally entering the Benedictine order, fulfilling her long-held hopes to become a nun. Joy and her mother had been part of our family. She had been a classmate of Lionel Bowen's in primary school, an old student mentored by Dr. Paddy Ryan of the movement, and she'd been secretary of the local ALP branch. She took us into another world that day. The Benedictine community embraced our family. On the 31st of August 2005, we celebrated her life with the community at Jamboree. We remain part of the Benedictine family today and discuss constantly on our visits about why we are Catholic and will continue to be. These women have been a role model to us. One of the most frequent pieces of advice we receive on our many visits is, Deirdre, Grant, Diana, we need to be informed. You don't get informed, and even they've said this, by the Catholic Weekly. We pray for change in the Church of Rome and often talk of the importance of the great gift given to us by John Paul XXIII and Vatican II, and pray for recognition of the role of women in the life of the Church. Another important part of my life was the long friendship since my school days with Father Eddie Kelly, who later became an MSc, who later became auxiliary bishop in Sydney and then became the Bishop of Toowoomba prior to Bishop Bill Morris. Over the years when he was away in Toowoomba, he always reserved one night of the Bishops' Conference for dinner at our home. We had lots of conversation about church. I just wanted to mention one special occasion when we got to discussing parliamentary privilege and sort of Vaticanese and the difficulties sometimes you could experience. And he said to me, get me a piece of paper, and I did. And then he wrote on the piece of paper, verbum scriptum mane, and underneath he wrote, so I could understand what it meant, the written word remains, which was really a warning about that's how things were done over there. You had to be very careful if you were putting something on paper. And of course in those days it took a year before you got a response to a letter, and that's one of the problems the church, or no, it's not a problem, that's one of the things that's going to change the church at the moment, this instant communication worldwide. And anyway, I've always kept that, it's in my little file. Having worked in library, I'm a terrible hoarder of pieces of paper. How things changed in our parish during the reign of Father Lou Tosi, a man who preached confrontation from the pulpit during the 70s and 80s. On taking over the role of president of the Mothers Club at OLR, because there weren't any other volunteers, the outgoing president gave me one piece of advice. If Tosi tells you black is white, don't argue. She was right. However, there came times when you had to stand your ground. with several altercations, a couple of which caused me to confront him in the sacristy after Mass on a Sunday. This Sunday morning, he had used his homily to congratulate the Sydney City Council workers for hosing those in silent vigil in Martin Place, commemorating the Sharpeville massacre. And I had known one or two of those priests who were involved. He fumed that some Catholic priest had participated, and he called them from the pulpit young men without wisdom teeth, who would have been better occupied demonstrating against the Royal Easter Show being open on Good Friday. It was time for a change. We became involved in Rosebery Parish, where we found Father Christopher Shee. In the latter part of 1984, Father Chris went to Ottawa to complete a canon law degree. I had the job over the years he was away to keep him up to date with what was happening here, especially in the political arena. On his return to Sydney, he took over the running of the Marriage Tribunal for the Archdiocese of Sydney, became Episcopal Vicar for Sydney, Canberra and Goulburn, served a parish which had an average weekly attendance some 10% higher than the other churches in Sydney. Father Chris, who left us on August the 6th, 2011, has left us with a great legacy. St Mary's Cathedral was packed to the rafters. Almost 100 priests were present on the altar to celebrate a wonderful life of giving and caring and great wisdom. I might say God is good. It just so happened that our Cardinal was in the Middle East. I think he was on Mount Sinai. And so it happened that Bishop Jeff Robinson was the chief concelebrant of the Mass. So I have to say this was a celebration of two things, Father Chris and the return of Jeff Robinson to the cathedral. Nobody thought we'd ever see him there again. I would like to read you just some of Christopher's own words printed in our parish bulletin. A parish bulletin that went out every week, and there was always something in it, and you just couldn't. I kept every one. And these words gave us encouragement, inspiration, and the strength to soldier on in difficult times. He was pastoral, charismatic, and his homilies, though never long, made the gospel values relevant in our lives every week. And this is from 2010 in one piece. What does loyalty mean? I'm sometimes asked why I'm not more loyal to the Holy See. I regard myself as loyal to the Holy See, even insofar as I challenge the Holy See, or question the Holy See, or wonder about the values that Rome puts forward in the world. There must be dialogue and discussion in the Church, not dumb obedience. And finally, questioning the Holy See may well be something I do too often. I sometimes wonder if I'm becoming obsessed. However, my loyalty is to the whole Church, to the people of God. I cannot limit my loyalty to the hierarchy in Rome. The Church, like the truth, is bigger than that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deirdre. You've got an uphill battle now, Frank. Follow that. Frank Brennan is a member of the Society of Jesus. He was awarded the Order of Australia. He's Professor of Law at the Public Policy Institute, Australian Catholic University, and Adjunct Professor at the College of Law and the National Centre for Indigenous Studies, Australian National University. He is also Advocate in Residence for Catholic Health Australia, Catholic Social Services, and the St Vincent de Paul Society on the social determinants of health. He is a founding director of the UNIA Social Justice Centre and a former country director of the Jesuit Refugee Service in East Timor, and a whole lot of other things. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Frank Brennan.
Thank you, Michael, Deirdre, ladies and gentlemen. I first of all want to pledge for a little sympathy. I mean, playing to Grisabin's home crowd, she's wowed you all, I just think is very unfair. So if I had any sense, I'd say I'd just second the motion and sit down. But I will say a few more things. What does it mean to you to be a Catholic? I mean, one of the great things is whatever the differences between Deirdre and myself, I know that I can come here and the things we share are so deep and over so many generations that we'll understand exactly where we're at and where we're headed and what we're committed to. And that's one of the great things, I think, about being Catholic. I'll make one gratuitous observation, Deirdre, that is, given that you've pointed out that the Labor Party and the Church are in a hell of a mess, it would seem that working to get a woman in the top job doesn't of itself provide the answer. So there's a lot to be done in the church. I was thinking over the week I've just spent in terms of what does it mean to be a Catholic, and even for me I'm travelling a little too much. Last Sunday afternoon I arrived in Townsville and I was met by Father Mick Peters, who's a priest originally from Toowoomba, aged 66. He's been chaplain to the Aboriginal community up there in the Townsville diocese for probably getting on 30 years. That morning he had done 10 baptisms. He is as happy as a pig in mud. You've probably never met him, you'll never hear of him. He is one of the silent types. There aren't many of them, but my God, when you come across them, you know what the Catholic Church is about. Next day, I had 2 days then on Palm Island with a politician, a bit different from Deirdre Griswold, but like her, a Catholic, the Honourable Bob Katter. Now, I first knew Katter almost 30 years ago when he was the Queensland National Party Minister for Aboriginal Affairs. There he was for a day and a half on Palm Island to meet with the Community Council there to see how they could get greater self-determination given the constraints put upon them by Canberra. Being an independent member of Parliament now, he doesn't care whether it's John Howard, Kevin Rudd, Julia Gillard or whatever. He's even got to the stage, I heard him twice during a public meeting on Palm Island say, us blackfellas. And I looked at him at one stage and he said to me, well, you know, if you've come from Cloncurry, you've got to have a bit of Calcadoon somewhere in you. But that sense of identification, extraordinary. Sat down in the community club that night and one of the Aboriginal councillors turned to me and said, you know, Father Frank, all the councillors, we're all old boys of St Michael's School. St Michael's Primary School, I remember being there some years ago for the 50th anniversary of the school, set up by the Franciscan Missionaries of Mary, and after lunch they asked me whether I was going to come for the reading of the school roll. And I thought I couldn't imagine anything more boring. Anyway, went along for the reading of the school roll by the French-Canadian sister who'd worked on that island for about 40 years. She'd returned to read the roll. A primary school. So 50 years before, the kids would have been aged from 5 to 12. They now would have been 55 to 62. She read the roll. Every second name that was read out, they said, deceased, deceased, deceased. No substitute for a church which is there. Mass and breakfast the next morning with the Sisters of the Good Samaritan, God bless them. The FMMs have now finished their mission there on Palm Island. Sisters of the Good Samaritan, at the same age as the majority of you here today, imagine giving their lives to going there just to be with the people. Flew back to the mainland with Katter. He said, I want you to catch up for lunch with Alan Sheldrick, theologian, parish priest in that part of the world. Katter has just recently written to the Pope. Why? Because he says he has the largest geographic electorate in the country almost, and within his lifetime there will be no Australian Catholic priests left in his electorate. And he says to the Pope, how can we be the church without the Eucharist? And why can't you be considering options? He blames me for getting him to write the letter. He thought I should. I said, look, if a trendy lefty Jesuit writes the letter, they won't take the least notice. When the ratbag conservative independent member of Parliament says, God help us, we are not going to be able to celebrate the Eucharist anywhere in my electorate in my lifetime, can't something happen? Let's do something about it. Then on the plane down to Melbourne for a public conversation in the BMW Federation Square there with Archbishop Philip Freer, the Anglican Archbishop. I first met him when he was the parish priest of Kowanyama up in Cape York in 1982. So we've known each other all that time. We know we've got theological differences, but what a pleasure it is to be able to engage in the public square with a church leader who's prepared to convene meetings to say, I'm not here to talk about the Anglican way of doing things. I'm here to talk about what's the common good, what's the public interest, and is there something that we have to contribute. Back to Canberra then for a meeting with people who work in Catholic health throughout Australia, doing their certificate in leadership and Catholic identity, discussing what are critical questions that confront us. People there from St John of God Health in Perth. They run a fabulous private hospital enterprise throughout the nation, but it's because of their Catholic identity they've said there's something missing. What we've got to do, we've got to run at least one public hospital, and we've got to do it in a very poor and developing part of the capital, Perth. And so they've won the tender for that. They're absolutely delighted. All sorts of protests, oh, you don't do abortions, you don't do sterilisations, etc. They say, that's right, we don't. But no public hospital offers the full suite of services, they say. And look, if you want those services, you can get them elsewhere. And don't you think it's worthwhile that there be some institutions not run by the state where there's a particular ethos which you can harness? Confirm the next day when I come here to Sydney. I'm on the National Board of St Vincent's Health. We have a discussion. We've just recently had the opening of the Kinghorn Cancer Centre here that some of you would be aware of. A wonderful event where a young woman who'd been a leukemia sufferer in the St Vincent's facility got up and spoke in the presence of the Prime Minister and everybody else. And she spoke about how wonderful it was to have come through a cancer treatment where you could have meditation, where you could have contact with a social worker who understood your pastoral needs. We do have something which is there to contribute. And so, later in the week, just back from Armidale, get up there to speak at a graduation at the university, robing there in the Chancellor's, splendid facilities, all the hobnobs of the New England tableland or whatever, obviously none of them Catholic. And one of them looks at me and says, "Oh, you're a Catholic priest." I said, "Yes. Must be very tough to do that nowadays." And it is, with the whole abuse thing that's confronting us. I mean, we're up against it, big time, and much more than the other churches seem to be. And it's something that we have to face. And that's part of the reality. But then to be able to engage there in a university audience, the first fella to come up and get his PhD, wonderful man from East Timor, who'd done his PhD on Fretlin and their education policies 1973 to 1978. I congratulate him at the end. The first person he'd phoned in Portugal, Bishop Bello, to tell him, "I've just got the doctorate." I mean, as a church, as a social institution, I think we're hard to beat. But we know that there are enormous problems. And so returning, I should say, giving the speech, the Vice-Chancellor who introduced me, an ex-Jesuit, good mate of mine, great fellow, there'd been a reference to the fact that Kevin Rudd had once described me as an ethical burr in the nation's saddle. He misread the script and said that I was an ethical blur in the nation's saddle. And with Tony Windsor on the stage and Richard Torbay, the national candidate, as the Chancellor, and Barnaby Joyce sitting in the audience with a hat as big as you've ever seen, he said, well, maybe with the political paradigm of the moment, that's about as good as we can get it, being an ethical blur. And maybe given the challenges we have in the church, that's about as good as we can get it. So, in terms of what it means to be a Catholic today, and yes, I'll conclude in a couple of minutes, Michael. It's about being a Christian. It's about being Catholic. For me, it's about being a Jesuit, and it's about being a Catholic priest. And I know there are some, including some bishops, who think those things are mutually exclusive. They're not. It's all part of the one recipe. What's the great challenge to us in terms of being Catholic? I think it is affirming that whatever the problems of the moment, we know that this is the institution and it is the community which we find most privileged, in which we can discern the presence of Christ and the action of the Spirit, particularly within the pluralistic democratic society of which we are a part. And in doing that, we see that we can hold in tension truth and freedom. And we know that one of the hardest things about being Catholic at the moment is the Vaticanese, which so overemphasise what they think is their command on absolute truth, and so demeaning of the dignity of those in the pews whose freedom and conscience is so essential. But second is the tension between authority and conscience. We are not a people who say in a sort of Presbyterian fashion that conscience rules all, that we will simply decide for ourselves. No, we see authority as being very important, and we treasure that authority. We also see a tension between idealised tradition and historical consciousness. And we take seriously the fact that we are embodied now in the history of which we are a part. And also we see a tension between hierarchy and community. Yes, there are certain bishops, etc., who give us the complete irrits, but we know that it is necessary that we be part of a hierarchical church. We lament when that hierarchy is not fully embodied in the life of the community, but that's where we need the humility to be able to serve with them. And then, as we've seen with the Bishop Morris affair, there's the tension between papal primacy and due process. And probably one of the things that makes our church the least likeable to the coming generations is talk about papal primacy, where they say, well, where's the transparency, where's the honesty, where's the due process, where's the real engagement with the real problems people are confronting in the world? And as I say, having been involved in the Bill Morris affair, I espouse papal primacy, but anyone who espouses papal primacy who does not insist on absolute transparency, absolute due process by everyone under Peter, simply is giving an apology and an explanation and a rationalisation that Peter can do what he damn well likes. Well, he can't. And so we have to insist on due process and transparency. So that ultimately, for us to be Catholic today, I think, to quote the great encyclical of Benedict, Caritas in Veritate, it's holding together charity and truth. And I don't know of any other believing community where I would be so at home in wrestling with the tension between charity and truth. Namely, I would only fail to speak the truth in charity, and I would only fail in the exercise of charity so as to proclaim the truth. There are some, of course, in the midst of our church who say there's never any tension. Well, they've never lived life. So that's why I think it's great to be a Catholic.
Five minutes to talk amongst yourselves, and then we'll reconvene at past. All right, ladies and gentlemen. We've got just the one mic, and I think if we give it to the speakers, so if you wish to ask a question, you'll be acknowledged. Please stand up and speak as loudly as you possibly can, and the speakers will take it from there. So Frank and Deirdre, I think if you both come and stand together so that it's much easier to have a conversation that way.
We'll stand together.
Yeah. So would anybody like to start off either with a question or a comment?
Oh yes, I know this one. Yes.
I want to know if the Jesuits can be Pope.
Oh. I think Martini was our best chance.
Oh, you keep holding it to see who they want to ask next.
Down the back there.
Some say canonically there are problems because if you are elected, you have to go to the Pope to get permission to be exempt from your vows as a Jesuit, so I don't know.
Would you say something about your parents, please, St. Jared? I believe he's a daily communicant. He must have had a great... What influence did your parents have on your life?
Right, the influence of my parents, Jared and Patricia. Yes, they're daily communicants, and they've always, like hearing Deirdre speak, they've always had very close relationships with their parish priests. I think most bishops wouldn't know them if they fell over them, but that's never worried them. And they've never been part of any of those other things. I remember Dad went to a funeral recently and he came back and he said, I was the only one who wasn't wearing a funny gown. So, all those nights of whatever. So my parents people of very strong faith. I remember I started at the MSC's boarding school in Toowoomba as a boy, aged 12 in 1966. Now, going from Brisbane up to Toowoomba to boarding school was not the easiest thing to do at age 12, but quite seriously, my parents had said at the time, well, we think the girls will be well looked after at All Hallows there with the Mercies, but we think if the boys can be taught by priests who have got theology degrees, that's probably a good thing. So for them, an informed faith was always very important. What some of you Sydney-siders might not know is that my father's first cousin is a great character and a great enthusiast, namely Father Grove Johnson, who back in the 60s had a lot to do with Roger Pryke, Ted Kennedy, then in later years was rector of the seminary here in Sydney, and brother-in-law of Morris Byers and sister Pat Byers. And Grove, when he was in Rockhampton, he would drive down from Rockhampton probably about once a month or so, and he would stay up all night over a whiskey discussing theology with my parents. They would be absolutely exhausted the next day, and Grove would be full of marvellous enthusiasm. So there are some of the factors that were at play in their lives.
Michael?
Frank, could I just add a corollary to your story about Bob Catter's letter to the Pope? Recently, I came across a diary or an autobiography that Bishop John Jobster wrote. It fell off the back of a truck. I don't think it'll ever be published for legal reasons.
I hope for my personal reputation it's never published. He thought I was a communist and locked me out of the diocese.
Well, that makes it all the more unlikely that I found two passages in his story. He was the Bishop of Broome for many years, a German-born Palatine, member of the Palatine Order. He's one of the two Australian bishops who were at Vatican Council who are still living. The other is Bishop Miles McEwen of Bunbury, and they're both into their 90s. But the two things in the diary related to two ad limina visits that Bishop Jobst had paid first to Pope Paul VI. Can't remember the date, but it would have been probably the early 1970s, and then later to John Paul II. And each time he said, I said to the Pope, can I ordain Aboriginal men, because we're desperately short of priests. And he said he got a flat no from Paul VI, and more or less the equivalent from John Paul, except he said others asked me the same question, but I think implicitly it's not going to happen. I thought that's interesting because as his treatment of you would indicate, he was not a raving radical.
Sure.
But did Bob Catter in his letter ask for that? Is that one of the things?
Yes. He asked for married priests and surely at least deacons, and why can't we be doing more in terms of the people of the Eucharist? Yeah. But tomorrow night I'll be addressing the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Catholic Council conference in Melbourne, and it'll be an admirable group of people, Aboriginal Australians. They've travelled vast distances at great expense. They'll turn up and they love the church, but yes, they do not have their own priests. And I remember years ago, Arthur Malcolm, very wonderful man, Anglican Aboriginal bishop from Yarrabah in far north Queensland, still alive, still up there in action. But Arthur spoke with the Australian Catholic bishops many years ago and said, well, if you're not going to allow married priests, you will never have Aboriginal Catholic priests. He said, and he put it very bluntly to them, he said, look, by the time any of us get around to thinking about service in terms of being a priest, we've sown our wild oats, we've established our families, and we're getting underway. And if you're going to say such people can't be priests, well, you're ruling out priesthood for Indigenous Australians.
The gentleman standing down the back.
Just a question, Steve.
sources of your personal Catholic faith in the political arena, say an issue or an item that you needed special courage to attend to, something that perhaps the boys in Sussex Street or the police force or so on were opposed to you, or to Franco Arena, an issue that was dear to your heart, something that stood out in your political career, and you needed the help of God in being an advocate for somebody who is being persecuted or an issue that needed attended to?
Well, yes, well, I guess...
Please. Repeat the question.
Yes, would you please repeat?
The question is, in essence, Deirdre, was there a time when you drew upon your Catholic faith strength from God to deal with a particularly difficult public issue?
Thank you very much. Look, I think there were times when various things happened, and yes, there was quite a deal of stress in life. I suppose the most difficult thing for me was getting up the reference on paedophilia at the Police Royal Commission. That and of course that cost me dearly. I never ever would have changed anything that I did because I knew I had to do it. That's all I can say. And I've never had a regret about it. All right.
Right down the back. I think you might have to come up. I can already sense your voice is very soft. I'll take the microphone down. Come on.
That's good.
No. Can you meet me halfway, please?
Thank you, Father Brennan, for your various for your advocacy and measured and legal interpretation of the law on refugees. I have two questions. What are your ideas for a solution to stop the pull factors for the boat people, which causes unnecessary deaths? And the second question is, it does not appear as if the group on refugees with Mr. Paris as one of its members does not publicise that it discriminates with which refugees are the most needy in terms of violence against them. And I understand that the report did say that the most vulnerable should be differentiated.
Thank you. Well, it's a complex set of issues, and I've written a lot about it, which you can find on the web. But just very briefly, I think for us Australians, we still entertain the thought in the 21st century that we're an island nation continent, and so we can set up hermetically sealed borders, and we can ensure that the only people who ever get here on visas. Now, if you live in a country which has land borders, you don't waste any energy overthinking that, and you don't be hard on your politicians because they can't enforce it. Just think about the south of the United States. They have people coming from Mexico every morning before breakfast, and in fact, the Californian economy depends upon it. So we have an obsession, first point. Second is we have a number of possessions in the Indian Ocean which are quite close to Indonesia. If we want hermetically sealed borders, we should get rid of those Indian island possessions. We'll never do that because we want them for security reasons. Well, you can't have your cake and eat it too. So if you want to keep hold of the Indian island possessions, you have to accept that now de facto we have virtually the equivalent of a land border with Indonesia. This means the only thing that will ever work is close, trusting negotiation and compromise with the Indonesians. I have sympathy with politicians who want to set up or stop the queue or whatever, but at the moment there is no queue. So I think with the Indonesians we have to do the hard work to set up the queue and agree on how many we take from Indonesia, and then ultimately if someone were to jump the queue and head on a boat, you'd put them at the end of the queue, and if they did it a second time you'd send them back and say you'll never come to Australia. But we're a long way from doing that. So in the meantime, yes, we've had the expert panel, 3 members. They had to do a quick job in 6 weeks. They redesigned the Pacific solution, which what was called the no advantage test. No criticism of them, that none of them are international lawyers. The no advantage test is, it's fudgy, it's incomprehensible. It's what you might call an ethical blur. If it were workable, Philip Ruddock would have done it years ago. Anyway, everyone was in a panic in Canberra. The report came in at 7 in the morning. By lunchtime, everyone had signed off on it. Truly ridiculous. It won't work, but those of us who think the Pacific solution's unethical, we at least hope it will work, because if you're doing something unethical, you at least want some good results out of it. But where they spoke about different treatment of the vulnerable, they were actually talking about those who you send to Nauru or Manus Island. You've got to have a particular eye to the vulnerable, particularly to the unaccompanied minors. Now, unaccompanied children remains the great moral quandary for us as a nation, as it did with the so-called Malaysia solution. If you send the kids offshore, it's immoral. If you don't send them offshore, it's unworkable. So it's a very great conundrum for us in Canberra.
I'd like to ask for a comment about 2 things. The first thing is, the first situation is the German bishops, with the permission of the Pope, very publicly demanding that any Catholic who doesn't pay their church tax, and I'm aware it's a different system, are excommunicated. They didn't use the word, but you know the story. I'd like you to comment on that in the light of pedophilia in Germany and in the light of the way the church is supposed to be portraying Christ. And the second thing is, I've worked with our Indigenous people right up in the territory, the Kimberleys and New Bishop Yops Well, etc., and we will never ever have them as first-class citizens while we lock them out of the church, and they're just so spiritual and so beautiful, and I think that's a tragedy. There's only Boniface Perdert and Patrick who was in order.
Thanks, mate.
Well, I think you've implied the answer about the German bishops, and I think particularly those of us of an egalitarian Australian background would say, well, it's ridiculous. And,
but it's wrong.
Well, it's ridiculous and it's wrong, yes. And it doesn't purport to be an infallible teaching, so we are allowed to say it's wrong. In fact, they haven't even issued a Vatican decree saying we're not allowed to talk about it. So I think we should exercise our license and talk about it and say we think it's ridiculous and wrong, and we hope it will change. We won't waste much breath on it here in Australia because it will change, and I think it'll change fairly soon.
And the Pope signed off on it, that's what.
Well, whatever of that,
must
yeah.
have had a bad night.
Now, in terms of Broome and Indigenous Church and lockout, there was a wonderful Palatine who you probably knew up there years ago, Mick McMahon.
I knew him well.
And when I was quite involved at the time when we were getting initiatives going with national reconciliation, and I used to often give speeches talking about, the divide between Aborigines and the rest of us and all of that. And I was walking around Broome with Mick McMahon one night, and he at that stage he was running all these cooperatives, including the local funeral parlour, and Aboriginal people were employed there, etc. And he said to me, you've made a good point in what you've been saying, that Aboriginal people don't feel welcome in the church, and the church is a white fella institution. He said that's true everywhere except here in Broome. And at that time, when Mick McMahon was the parish priest, the church was a very privileged place where Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people were there together, and they felt absolute equality. And I mean, that is the church at its best. And as you know, in '86, the Pope said, the church will not be fully the church that Jesus wants her to be until you, the Aboriginal people, have made your contribution to her life, until that contribution has been joyfully received by others. And that still remains the challenge.
One last question or comment.
For Deirdre.
Oh,
This gentleman.
Everybody knows we have a year of grace on our hands. I thought this might be a great opportunity to learn more about Jesus, have Bible studies, but no, we've got a relic of some grace.
I know.
Well, anyhow, I'm horrified at that. I mean, where are we going to get grace from looking at from where there's arm inside a box?
I think Deirdre should comment on that.
Listen, nothing surprises me anymore. I just think, sometimes, I don't know whether it's a factor, it's a male factor or what, but some of the things, the decisions that are being made by these males, they need some women to advise them, for God's sake. That's the truth. That's the truth. They need to have happen one day, there'll be some enlightenment. I don't know, but I tell you what, I think they're going to get a shock when they get to heaven. Because I'm telling you what, I think they'll be given the rounds of the kitchen table and told what an idiot lot they were. Okay? All right?
I can be personal and anecdotal. I'm the superior of the Jesuit community in Canberra, and we had the arm turn up in Canberra the other day. And I had allocated Father Des Purcell, a member of my community, to be the allocated Jesuit person to accompany the arm, because Des had worked in India as a missionary. And I thought, well, he'll be able to tell some stories about what it was to be a missionary in India. Anyway, wouldn't you know it, the afternoon before the solemn Vespers in the cathedral, Des got sick. So I had to go and preach. Anyway, it was good for me, and my homily is available on the Eureka Street website. So have a read.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank us. Concludes our Q&A for the year, unfortunately, but again, the last celebration of the beginning of the Second Vatican Council will be upstairs, October the 11th, 6:30 p.m. Mass. There are copies of booklets for sale on the back. Go home, go in peace, go the doggies.